The dog's paws were bleeding on the brick. A man knelt beside it in snow that moved sideways through the black skeletons of chimneys, his coat patched with flour sack cloth, his bare hands pulling at a mound of frozen rubble while the wind tore the sound from his mouth. Behind him, a horse stood with its head below its knees, shaking so hard the saddle creaked. The ruins around them had no roofs, no doors, no glass, just walls open to the storm like broken teeth. The dog stopped digging. It pressed its nose against one spot in the mound and whined. Not at the cold, not at the dark, but at something underneath that only the animal could feel. The Merriweather outfit died the way most cattle operations died that winter, not in one clean blow, but in a long bleeding out that left men standing in mud yards with nothing to show for a season's work. Tilden Rusk had ridden for Merriweather since the previous April, pushing stock across grass that turned brown by August and vanished under snow by November. The foreman, a gap-toothed Texan named Pollard, gathered the remaining hands in the lee of a hay barn on a morning so cold the horses' breath froze on their own muzzles. He told them the truth. The outfit owed more than it owned. The cattle had drifted into coulees where no rider could reach them. The investors in Chicago had stopped answering letters. Pollard gave each man a choice: wait for wages that would never come, or take what the outfit could spare and ride out before the next storm sealed the country shut. Tilden took a horse named Juniper, a bay gelding with a shallow chest and a habit of stumbling on frozen ground. He took his dog, Brindle, a brindled cattle dog with one torn ear and a jaw that could hold a bull calf's nose, but could not hold warmth in a blizzard. He took $43 in wage scrip that no merchant between the Mussel Shell and Helena would accept at face value: $2.60 in actual coin, half a sack of oats, 3 strips of jerked beef thin enough to see light through, a dull knife, a hatchet with a loose head, a hoof pick, and 6 matches in a tobacco tin. He did not take a bedroll because the outfit's blankets had been pledged against a feed debt. He was 29 years old. He had been born near the Red River and raised along cattle routes by men who taught him how to move stock and keep his mouth shut. He was not married. His younger sister Annie worked laundry in Helena and had written him a letter that arrived 3 weeks late, folded small enough to fit inside his hatband. The letter said she was ill. It said she owed $11 in backboard. It said she did not know what would happen if the money did not come. Tilden folded the letter back into his hat and pointed Juniper west. The distance between the Merriweather yard and Helena was not the problem. A man on a sound horse in fair weather could make it in hard riding. The problem was that the weather had not been fair since early December, and it was now the second week of January in the year 1887, and the northern plains had entered a killing season that would not break until March. Snow lay 3 feet deep on the flats. Drifts along creek banks ran 6 and 8 feet. The temperature had not climbed above 0 in 11 days. The wind came out of the north and did not stop. Tilden knew one thing with certainty. If he stayed on the main wagon road, he would reach a relay station in 28 miles. If his horse held, if the road stayed visible, if no new storm dropped before he got there, 28 miles in deep snow on a weak horse. A man walking behind a horse in those conditions would sweat through his coat in the first hour. Sweat would freeze. Frozen sweat would steal heat faster than the wind. The man would slow. He would sit down to rest. He would not get up. There was a second route, the old mining road that cut through the benches toward a string of abandoned camps, 19 miles instead of 28. But the mining road crossed exposed ridges where a man could lose the trail in 10 steps of blown snow, and it had not been maintained since the silver operations closed 3 years before. Tilden had no good option. He had a less bad one. He chose the mining road because 19 miles was 9 miles shorter than 28, and because Juniper's legs were already shaking before they left the barn. The stage stable at the Muscle Shell Crossing was the last structure with a roof and a fire before the open country began. Tilden reached it near midday with frost on his eyelashes and ice crusted along Brindle's spine. The stable was low-roofed, thick with the smell of manure and wet horse blankets, and occupied by 4 men who looked at Tilden the way men look at something they expect to find dead by morning. One of them was Asa Trask. Asa was 54 years old, a deputy stock inspector with a face like a cured hide and hands that had roped, branded, and buried more cattle than most men would see in a lifetime. He had been a trail boss before the inspecting work, and before that, a bull whacker on the Bozeman Road. He knew winter the way a surgeon knows a blade, not with fear, but with a respect so deep it looked like contempt for anyone who did not share it. He watched Tilden water Juniper at the trough inside the stable. He watched the horse drink with its legs spread wide for balance. He watched Brindle press against Tilden's boot and shiver. Asa said, "Where are you pointed?" Tilden said, "Helena." Asa looked at the horse. He looked at the sky through the stable door, which was the color of a tin plate held over a candle. He said, "Not on that animal." Tilden said nothing. He knew Asa was right about the horse. He also knew that knowing did not change anything. Asa crossed the stable floor. His boots left prints in the frozen muck. He stood close enough that Tilden could smell tobacco and wood smoke, and the particular sourness of a man who had not been warm in weeks. Asa said, "I've seen men freeze within shouting distance of a barn, within arm's reach of a door. The wind takes your direction first, then your feeling, then your judgment, then your life." He looked at Brindle. "A dog finds cattle, boy. He does not find mercy under ashes." Tilden said, "I have a sister in Helena who is ill." Asa said, "You have a sister in Helena who will be sad when they tell her you died." The stable owner, a thick man with a permanent squint, came to the argument the way stable owners always came to arguments thou, with a price. He told Tilden the horse could stay for $2 a night. The dog could stay for nothing if it did not fight. Tilden could sleep in the loft for 50 cents. Meals were extra. Tilden had $2.60 in coin. One night would leave him 60 cents. 2 nights would leave him nothing, and his horse would belong to the stable for the debt. He looked at Juniper. The horse stood with its head low and its ribs showing through a coat that should have been thick but was not, because the Merriweather outfit had run out of decent feed in November. He looked at Brindle, who was watching the stable door the way the dog always watched doors. Not with fear, but with a question. The dog wanted to know what was on the other side. Tilden paid nothing. He tightened the cinch, checked the hatchet in his saddlebag, and led Juniper back into the wind. Asa Trask stood in the stable door and watched him go. He did not call after him. He did not offer help. He stood with his arms folded inside his coat and his jaw set, and he looked like a man watching a funeral that had not yet been scheduled. The first 3 miles on the mining road were sheltered by a line of cottonwoods along a frozen creek. The snow was deep, but the wind was broken, and Juniper moved at a walk that was slow but steady. Brindle trotted ahead, nose to the ground, then circled back, then trotted ahead again. The dog's pattern was always the same: forward, check, return, report. Tilden had learned to read the dog's returns. A fast circle meant clear ground ahead. A slow circle meant something worth attention. A full stop meant danger. By the 4th mile, the cottonwoods ended and the road climbed onto an exposed bench. The wind hit Tilden's right side like a hand made of ice. Snow moved sideways so fast it did not fall. It flew. Within minutes, The road vanished. Tilden could see Juniper's ears, and the snow between them and nothing beyond. He dropped the reins to the horse's neck and trusted the animal's feet to find the packed surface beneath the drift. Juniper found it, for another mile. Then the horse stumbled on something buried, a rock, a frozen rut, a piece of timber, and went to its knees. Tilden dismounted and pulled. Juniper rose but would not move forward. The horse stood with its head turned away from the wind and its whole body shaking. Tilden looked back. The bench behind them was white and featureless. He looked ahead. The bench ahead was the same. The sky had dropped to the height of a man on horseback, and everything above the snow was the same gray-white nothing in every direction. He was 6 miles from the stable. He was 13 miles from anywhere else. His horse had stopped. His hands, inside gloves made from flour sackcloth and saddle leather, had stopped feeling the reins. Brindle did not stop. The dog pushed forward into the wind, belly low to the snow, and then turned left off the road. Brindle moved 20 paces, stopped, came back, and barked once. Not the bark that meant cattle, not the bark that meant stranger. A different bark, short, sharp, directed. The dog turned left again and moved into the white. Tilden had been told all his life that a man follows the road. The road is the plan. The road is the distance between death and a door. You do not leave the road in a blizzard. You do not follow a dog into open ground when you cannot see your own feet. But the road had stopped working. Juniper had stopped. The road was killing them by inches, and Tilden was too cold to pretend otherwise. He pulled Juniper's reins and followed the dog. What Brindle found was not shelter, not at first. At first it was just interruption, a break in the sameness, dark shapes rising out of the white, vertical lines where everything else was horizontal, a chimney stack, then another, then a wall with no roof, snow pouring through a window hole, then a standing door frame with no door, the hinges orange with rust. Gray quartz. Tilden knew the name because every man who worked the Montana ranges knew the names of the dead towns. Gray Quartz had been a silver camp, a boomtown that rose in 1880 on a vein discovery and burned in 1884 after a payroll panic triggered a night fire that took every building on the main street. The mine had already been failing. The fire finished what debt had started. Most buildings had been false front pine. They burned like kindling. The assay office, the company store, the hotel, the livery, all gone. The people scattered to other camps, other towns, other failures. 3 years of weather had pushed the ruins into the ground. Snow filled the roofless walls. Charred timber lay under white drifts like bones under skin. The wind moved through the empty window holes and made sounds that Tilden did not want to identify. There was no shelter here. A roofless building is worse than open ground because it traps snow and blocks the wind unevenly, creating pockets where a man can bury himself without realizing it. Tilden knew this. He started to pull Juniper through the ruins toward what he hoped was the far side, where the road might drop into a coulee with tree cover. Brindle would not follow. The dog stood in front of a mound of blackened brick and snow halfway along what had been the main street and barked, not once, not twice, continuously. The bark Tilden had never heard before, not cattle, not stranger, not warning, calling. The dog was calling him to something. Tilden pulled the reins. Juniper followed reluctantly. Tilden reached the mound and looked at it. A heap of brick, charred timber ends, ash frozen into a black crust, and snow packed over everything like a burial shroud. Nothing remarkable, nothing useful, nothing alive. But Brindle was digging. The dog's paws struck frozen brick and bled, and still the dog dug, not frantically, deliberately, in one exact place. Tilden looked at the spot and saw what the dog must have felt through its paws. The snow here was different. It sat in a shallow cup, slightly depressed, as if warmth, or at least less cold, was rising from below and melting the bottom layer. Snow does not sink unless something beneath it is warmer than the air above. Peter Vangen had taught him that. Peter Vangen was a man who understood stone the way other men understood cattle or cards. He was Norwegian-born, from a family of masons who had worked church foundations in the old country before crossing to Minnesota and then west. He was 61 years old when Tilden met him, working as a mine timberman and repair mason at a ranch supply depot south of the Judith Basin. His hands were permanently gray with morite dust. His left eye was clouded from a lime burn. He moved slowly and spoke less, but when he spoke, the words had the weight of the stone he worked. Tilden had helped Peter repair a collapsed spring house the previous autumn. It was not planned work. Tilden was passing through, needed to water juniper, and found an old man trying to lift a lintel stone alone. He helped because the alternative was watching a 61-year-old man crush his own hands. Peter noticed things about Tilden. He noticed that Tilden looked at where water had crept along mortar lines. He noticed that Tilden checked where Brindle chose to sleep, against the south wall, out of the draft, on dry ground, before choosing his own spot. He noticed that Tilden put his hand against a stone wall and held it there, feeling the temperature through the rock, the way a horseman puts his hand on a horse's flank to feel the breathing underneath. Peter said, "You listen to things that do not talk." Tilden said, "My dog listens. I just watch the dog." Peter laughed. It was the only time Tilden heard him laugh. Then Peter taught him something. He took Tilden to an abandoned root cellar behind the spring house. The cellar was half collapsed, earth-roofed, dug into a hillside. Peter crouched beside the entrance and held Tilden's hand against the stone wall. The stone was cold. Then Peter moved his hand 6 inches lower, near a crack in the foundation where the earth met the rock. The stone was warm, not hot, not even comfortable, but warmer than the air, warmer than the wall above, warmer than it had any right to be on an October evening. Peter said, "Buried masonry keeps yesterday's temperature longer than any man deserves. The earth remembers heat. The stone holds it. The air underground does not change as fast as the air above. A cellar in January may be cold, but it will not be killing cold, not if it is dry, not if it breathes." Then Peter lit a candle. He held it near the crack, near the vent where warmer air was leaking out. The flame leaned. It did not blow. There was no wind, but it leaned, pulled by the movement of air from warm space to cold. Peter said, "That is how you know a room is alive. If the candle leans, the air's moving. If the air's moving, you can breathe. If you can breathe, you can sleep. If you can sleep, you can survive." He paused, and his clouded eye caught the candle's light. "A sealed room without draft is a coffin. Remember that before you remember anything else." Tilden remembered it now. He stood in the ruins of gray quartz, with wind tearing at his coat, and his horse dying behind him, and his dog bleeding from the paws, and he remembered the candle leaning in Peter Vangen's hand. The mound where Brindle dug was not random debris. It was the remains of a building with a brick foundation, a foundation heavy enough to survive a fire that consumed everything above it. Tilden looked at the layout of the ruins. The mound sat where a substantial structure had stood, not a shack, not a storefront, something with weight, something built to hold more than walls. The bank. Gray Quartz had a bank. Every silver camp with a payroll had a bank, and banks in mining towns were built different from everything else. The building above might be pine and false front paint, but the foundation, the basement, the strong room, those were brick and masonry and iron, built to survive fire, theft, and the particular desperation of men who had not been paid. If the foundation survived the burn, there might be a basement. If there was a basement, there might be a strong room. If there was a strong room, it would be underground, walled in brick and lined in steel, and the earth around it would hold temperature the way Pater had shown him. But might was not survival. Might was a gamble made with the last strength in his hands. If he dug and found nothing, rubble, collapsed earth, a brick shell with no space inside, he would have spent his remaining energy on a dead hole while the storm sealed the road behind him. He would die beside his dog in the ruins of a town that had already killed itself. Merritt Klein's voice came to him then. Not the real Merritt. Merritt was somewhere on the main road, probably warm, probably mocking someone else. But the memory of Merritt's voice from a night around a branding fire, when Tilden had told the story of Pater's root cellar. Merritt had grinned and said, "A dog will chase a rabbit straight into hell and look proud when he gets there. And you're telling me you would follow the dog into a hole because an old Norwegian told you stone keeps warm?" Tilden had not answered then. He did not answer now. He dropped to his knees beside Brindle and began clearing bricks with bare hands. The method was Pater's, not his own. Tilden cleared the downwind side first, so loose snow would not refill the hole as he worked. He stacked bricks against the wind to build a low wall that broke the gale at knee height. He tested each timber before putting weight on it, pressing with his boot, listening for the crack that meant rot. Brindle dug beside him, shoulder deep in the mound, throwing back debris with a focus that made Tilden's chest tight because the dog was operating on something deeper than reason, something that came from the animal's nose and bones and blood. The first thing Tilden's hands found beneath the brick was a rusted iron handrail, a stair rail bolted to masonry. He cleared around it and found the top edge of a stair tread, then another, steps leading down. His heart hit his ribs so hard he tasted copper. He cleared faster. The wind screamed above his brick wall, and snow piled against his back, and his fingernails cracked on frozen mortar, but the stairs kept going down. 4 treads, 5, 6, then a landing and a turn, and more brick, and then the top seam of a door. Not a wooden door, a steel-plated door set inside a brick arch, the strong room door, the bank vault. Tilden sat back on his heels in the hole he had dug and stared at it. The door was rectangular, framed in blackened brick. The steel plating was warped by heat, but intact. The handle was rusted solid. The locking bolts, he could see 2 of them, were thrown but bent, heat-twisted in the fire 3 years ago. The door sat at a slight angle, pushed inward maybe half an inch by the weight of rubble that had piled against it from above. Air came through that half-inch gap. Not wind, air. The faintest movement carrying a smell that was not rot, not decay, not the stink of standing water. It smelled like dry paper and metal, like a room that had been sealed and forgotten, like a box that had kept its contents. Brindle pushed his nose against the gap and whined. Tilden had found the vault, but finding it and opening it were different things, and opening it and surviving inside it were different things still. The door was steel-plated and heat-warped and buried under 3 years of collapsed building. His tools were a hatchet with a loose head, a hoof-pick, and hands that were bleeding from the brick. Behind him, Juniper screamed. The sound cut through the wind, a high, terrified sound that meant the horse had reached the end of what an animal can endure. A sheet of roofing tin, pried loose by the storm from the skeleton of the livery, sailed through the ruins and struck the ground 20 feet from the horse. Juniper reared against the reins Tilden had tied to a standing door frame. Tilden had to choose: calm the horse or keep the stairwell from filling with snow that was already pouring in from the exposed side. He could not do both. A man alone in a blizzard with one set of hands cannot hold a horse and hold a hole at the same time. He chose the hole. He pulled 2 flat boards from the rubble, wedged them across the stairwell opening, and packed snow against them to form a crude windbreak over the stairs. The work took 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, Juniper screamed twice more, and the wind pushed another inch of snow into the cleared space around the door. Then he went to the horse. He spoke in the voice he used for frightened cattle, low, steady, a sound that meant nothing except presence. He pressed his forehead against Juniper's neck and felt the horse's pulse hammering through the frozen coat. He tied the reins shorter, pulled the horse behind the tallest standing wall he could find, a chimney stack with 3 sides still upright, and fed Juniper a double handful of oats from the half-sack. The oats would not last. The horse could not come underground. These problems would kill them both if the vault held nothing. But the air through the gap smelled like paper and metal, and Brindle was still whining at the door, and Tilden Rusk was out of choices that did not require faith in a dog and a dead man's lesson. He went back to the stairs. Orrin Voss had watched Tilden ride out of the stage stable 4 hours earlier, and he had said nothing. He had not needed to say anything. He had already said enough. Voss was 42 years old, a receiver for failed claims, unpaid stock paper, and distressed goods. In a winter that was destroying cattle operations across the territory, Voss was one of the few men making money. He bought what desperate men abandoned: horses, saddles, wage notes, small property, for pennies, and resold them to ranches that still had cash. He was not evil in the way that required shouting or violence. He was evil in the way that required patience. He waited for men to run out of options, and then he offered terms that sounded like help and worked like robbery. At the stage stable before Asa arrived, Voss had approached Tilden while Juniper drank. He had looked at the horse with the eyes of a man pricing meat. He had looked at Brindle and said, "That dog is worth more than the horse and more than the man riding him, and that is not a compliment to the dog." He had offered $5 for Juniper and Brindle together. $5 that would buy Tilden 2 nights at the stable and meals enough to wait for a freight wagon. $5 that would cost him his horse, his dog, and every mile of distance between himself and Annie. Tilden had said no. Voss had smiled. It was a thin smile, the kind that does not move the eyes. He had said, "You can sign over the wage script and the horse now, sleep in the shed one night, and wake alive. That is my best offer. My only offer." Tilden had said no again. Brindle had growled, not at the cold, not at a stranger, but at Voss specifically, a low, steady sound that came from the dog's chest like a warning carved in stone. Voss had kicked snow at the dog and said, "There is your banker, Rusk. Let him loan you supper." Now, 4 hours later, Voss stood at the edge of the stage stable and watched the mining road disappear into the white. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, a hand-drawn map of the Gray Quartz camp, acquired months ago from a freight company's survey records. He studied it for a moment. Then he folded it carefully and slipped it back inside his coat. Voss did not follow Tilden. Not yet. He had learned that patience was cheaper than pursuit, and that desperate men who rode into dead towns usually left behind everything worth taking. The lever Tilden needed was lying in the snow 40 paces from the bank foundation, half buried under the collapsed front wall of the livery. A wagon tongue, 8 feet of oak, cracked along one edge but solid through the center. heavy enough to brace against the vault door, long enough to give him leverage his arms alone could not provide. He dragged it to the stairwell. The effort cost him 10 minutes, and most of the feeling in his left foot. He wedged the thick end under the hinge strap of the vault door, braced the shaft against the brick arch, and pulled. The door did not move. He repositioned. He stacked flat bricks under the fulcrum point to raise the angle. He unhooked the saddle cinch from Juniper's gear and looped it around the wagon tongue's end to create a pull line. He wrapped the cinch leather around his right hand, planted his boots on the stair landing, and hauled backward with the weight of his entire body. The door shifted. A quarter inch. The cinch bit into his palm, and the wagon tongue groaned against the brick arch, and the door moved just enough that the gap widened from half an inch to nearly an inch. More air came out. The paper and metal smell was stronger now. Brindle pushed closer, pawing at the widened crack. Second attempt. Tilden reset his feet, tightened the cinch, and pulled again. This time, the cinch snapped. The leather, weakened by cold and age, and the strain of holding a saddle on a horse that should have been retired 2 seasons ago, split at the buckle hole. The broken end whipped back and caught Tilden across the temple. He slammed against the brick wall of the stairwell and sat down hard on the landing. Blood ran into his left eye. The cold made it feel like someone pouring water on his face. He wiped it with his sleeve and looked at his hands. His palms were split open along the lines where the cinch had pressed. His left boot sole, already thin, had peeled back from the stitching where he braced against the step. His head rang with a sound that was not the wind. He ate one strip of jerky. He tore it with his teeth because his hands could not grip well enough to break it. He gave Brindle the other half and then immediately regretted it because he had not inventoried anything yet, and feeding the dog before counting what remained was the kind of mistake that kills men who run out of margins. 3 strips of jerky. He had started with 3. He had eaten one and given half of another. He had 1.5 strips left. The oats were for Juniper. The $43 in wage scrip would not buy a cracker in a town that did not exist. Third attempt. Tilden used the wagon tongue alone, no cinch. He drove the thick end deeper under the hinge strap, packed brick shards beneath it to hold the angle, and threw his shoulder against the shaft. He pushed instead of pulling. His boot slipped on the icy stair. He fell, caught himself, repositioned, and pushed again. The door moved. Not a quarter inch, not half an inch, 2 inches. Enough that the gap between the door and the frame opened to a space the width of a man's flattened hand. Cool, dry air poured through it in a steady exhalation, and the sound was like a long-held breath finally released. Enough for a dog. Brindle squeezed through the gap. The dog turned sideways, pressed flat, and forced his body through the opening with a determination that scraped fur from his ribs. He vanished into the darkness beyond the door. Silence, then barking. Not the warning bark, not the stranger bark, not the calling bark from the mound above. A different sound, higher, faster. The bark Tilden had heard when Brindle found a lost calf alive in a snowdrift. The sound of discovery. Tilden dropped to his knees and pressed his face to the gap. The air that came out was cold, but not killing cold. It smelled like dust and tin and old paper. He could see nothing. The darkness inside was absolute. He reached into the tobacco tin in his coat pocket and pulled out one of his 6 matches. He struck it against the brick arch. The flame caught. He held it near the gap. The flame leaned inward. Air was moving into the vault, which meant air was also moving out somewhere else. A vent, a crack, a fissure in the masonry that connected the sealed room to the outside. The vault was breathing. Pater's lesson, demonstrated in candlelight at a root cellar, repeated now by matchlight at the door of a dead bank in a buried town. If the candle leans, the air is moving. If the air is moving, you can breathe. If you can breathe, you can sleep. If you can sleep, you can survive. The match burned down to his fingertips. He shook it out. He had 5 matches left. He put the wagon tongue back under the hinge strap, rebuilt the fulcrum, and pushed until something in his back pulled sharp enough to make his vision narrow. The door moved another inch, 2 more inches. The gap was now wide enough for a man, barely, if the man did not breathe in while passing through. Tilden Rusk squeezed through the door of the gray quartz bank vault and crawled into darkness on hands and knees, following the sound of his dog's voice. Tell us in the comments, have you ever trusted a sign everyone else dismissed? Because Tilden had just followed a bleeding dog through a steel door into a sealed room, and what he found in the dark would either save his life or end it. His hands found the floor first, not earth, not rubble. Flat stone, laid in courses, cold but dry. His knees found it next, smooth, unbroken, the kind of floor a mason sets when the room matters more than the building above it. He crawled forward, one hand sweeping ahead in the dark, and his fingers brushed wood. A shelf. A wooden shelf bolted to a stone wall, chest high when he rose to his knees. He ran his hand along it and felt shapes. Cylindrical, metal, cold, stacked in rows. Tins. He pulled one from the shelf. It was heavy for its size, the seam raised along the top, the label gone to dust or peeled away by years of dry air. He shook it gently. Something solid shifted inside. He set it down and reached for another. Same shape, same weight, same blind promise in the dark. He lit a second match. The vault was not large, perhaps 12 feet by 10, with a ceiling Tilden could touch if he raised his arm fully. The walls were brick, lined with steel plate on 2 sides, and the floor was dressed stone. 3 wooden shelving units stood against the walls, and on them, stacked in crates and in loose rows, were tins. Hundreds of tins, some in wooden crates stamped with the words, Gray Quartz Cooperative Store. Some loose, piled where hands had placed them quickly. Flour tins, beans, tomatoes, salmon, peaches, condensed milk, coffee. Hardtack boxes wrapped in oilcloth, the cloth still intact, the wax seal unbroken. On a shelf near the door, a leather-bound ledger lay open. The match was dying. Tilden brought it close enough to read the first line of the last entry. The handwriting was cramped, hurried, the ink smeared in one corner. It read, Provisions moved to vault for safekeeping during evacuation, to be retrieved upon return. No one had returned. The match burned his fingers. He dropped it. Darkness closed around him again, but it was a different darkness now. Not the darkness of a tomb, the darkness of a room that had been waiting. Brindle found him in the dark and pressed against his leg. The dog's body was warm. The dog's tail was moving. Tilden sat on the floor of the gray quartz bank vault, with his back against a crate of tinned peaches and his dog against his thigh. And he did something he had not done since Pollard told them the outfit was dead. He counted. He counted not what he had lost, but what he had found. Food. Sealed, stored, sheltered from weather for 3 years in a room built to resist fire and theft. Enough for 1 man and 1 dog for weeks. Maybe more than a month if he rationed. The tins were cold, but not frozen. The vault's temperature, held by earth and brick and stone, sat somewhere above freezing. The air moved through the gap he had forced in the door and through something else, a vent he had not yet found, and the movement meant the room would not kill him with its own breath, but he could not yet trust any of it. Tins sealed for 3 years might be sound or might be poison. A room underground might breathe now and stop breathing when snow sealed the vent. A floor might be dry tonight and flooded by morning if meltwater found a crack. The horse was still outside. The storm was still building. The dark was still absolute. He had found hope inside a sealed room, and hope inside a sealed room could turn deadly. Overhead, through the brick and rubble and snow, the wind screamed across the dead town of gray quartz. The burned walls caught the sound and bent it, and the old stovepipe still standing in the ruins moaned like voices calling from underground. Tilden struck his third match. He had 4 left. He began to count tins. The counting took 2 matches. Tilden could not afford to burn them long, so he worked in bursts. Strike, scan a shelf, memorize positions, darkness. Strike, scan the next shelf, memorize, darkness. Between matches he moved by touch, running his hands along tin seams, pressing his thumb against the tops to feel for the bulge that meant gas buildup inside. Petter had not taught him that. A camp cook named Staley had, years ago, after a man on a cattle drive ate from a swollen tin of corned beef and spent 3 days vomiting blood before he died in the back of a supply wagon. The vault held, by Tilden's count in the dark, roughly 200 tins. Not all were sound. His thumb found 4 with tops pushed upward like blisters. He set those on the floor away from the shelves and marked their position with a loose brick. 2 more tins leaked along the side seams. He could feel the dampness and the faint sour smell that leaked tins carry. Those went on the floor with the bulged ones. 3 tins had rusted through the bottom entirely and were empty, their contents long ago drained into the stone floor and dried to a dark stain. That left roughly 191 tins he could not yet condemn, but could not yet trust. He needed light to read whatever labels remained. He needed time to sort by sound. Pater had shown him that a good tin rings when you tap it with a knuckle, while a bad tin thuds. He needed a system, and systems required energy he was running out of. But first he needed air. The vault door gap let air in. Something else let air out. He had to find it before he slept, because a room that breathed through one opening might stop breathing if snow packed against the door during the night. One vent meant life. No vent meant Pater's warning. A sealed room without draft is a coffin. Tilden pressed his back against the far wall and worked his way along the perimeter by feel. Brick, brick, steel plate, brick. Then his fingers found a circle of iron set into the masonry at shoulder height. A pipe, roughly 2 inches across, choked with ash and debris. The vent. It ran upward through the wall at a slight angle, and when Tilden pressed his ear against it, he heard wind. Faint, high, distant. The vent connected the vault to the outside, somewhere above the rubble. He pulled the cleaning rag from his rifle kit, a strip of cotton worn thin from use, and tied it around the end of a willow switch he found among the debris on the stair landing. He pushed the switch into the vent pipe and worked it back and forth. Ash fell on his face. He kept pushing. More ash, then a crust of something harder, frozen moisture. Ice formed where warm vault air met cold outside air. He broke through it with the tip of the switch and felt the resistance give way. Air moved. Not much. A thread of cold from outside, pulling the warmer vault air upward and out through the pipe. He held his last but one match near the vent. The flame leaned toward the pipe. The vault was breathing through 2 openings, the door gap and the vent. Cross-draft. The room would not suffocate him. Tilden sat down on the stone floor and let the match burn all the way to his fingers before he shook it out. He had 3 matches left. He had a vault that breathed. He had tins that might be food. He did not yet have a floor he could sleep on without the cold stone stealing his heat through his back and legs. The stone would pull warmth out of a man's body the the way a river pulls warmth out of a swimmer. Pater had taught this lesson too at the spring house, the third skill. Pater had laid 2 oak slats across the cellar floor, set 6 inches apart, and placed a folded horse blanket across them. Then he had made Tilden lie on the blanket. The difference was immediate. Without the slats, the cold floor pressed against the blanket and drew heat straight through. With the slats, an inch of dead air sat between the blanket and the stone, and dead air is the poorest conductor of cold there is. Pater had said, "Raise your bed off the stone, not with blankets alone. Blankets compress, blankets transmit, with wood, with anything that keeps air between you and the ground." Tilden crawled back through the door gap and climbed the stairs into the storm. The wind nearly took him off his feet. He pulled 2 broken planks from the rubble pile near the collapsed livery and dragged them down the stairs. Then 2 more. He laid them across the vault floor in a rough platform, leaving gaps for air. On top of the planks, he spread loose paper from the ledger shelf, then a piece of canvas he found folded under a crate, then the wool coat. The wool coat. He had almost missed it. Inside a broken crate near the bottom shelf, wrapped in dust, stiff with age but intact, was a heavy wool coat. A bank clerk's coat by the cut, long, dark, double-breasted with bone buttons and a collar that came up to the ears. Beside it a small pry bar and 2 candle stubs. Tilden put on the coat over his own. The wool smelled like dust and lanolin and something faintly chemical, moth treatment, maybe, or the residue of the fire that had raged above while this room held. The coat was too wide in the shoulders and too short in the arms, but it was wool, and wool holds warmth even when the man inside it has stopped believing in warmth. He lit one of the candle stubs with his 4th match. 2 matches remained in the tin. The candle gave a circle of light that reached the walls and turned the vault from a blind hole into a room. He could see the shelves, the tins, the crates, the stone floor, the iron vent pipe. He could see Brindle, curled on the plank platform, watching him with eyes that reflected the flame like 2 copper coins. He opened the first tin with the pry bar. Tomatoes. The smell hit him with a force that made his legs weak, sweet, sharp, acidic, alive. He drank the juice first, then ate the fruit with his fingers. The tomatoes were soft, slightly darkened, but sound. No off-taste, no gas, no mold. He opened a second tin. Salmon. He gave half to Brindle and ate the rest in 3 bites, bones and all. The salt on his tongue was so intense his jaw ached. Then he stopped. He had eaten 2 tins in 4 minutes, and the hunger in his stomach was screaming for more, and Brindle was licking the empty salmon tin until it rang against the stone, and every instinct in his body said, "Open another. Open 10. Eat until the shaking stops." He did not open another. He counted what remained. 191 tins minus the 2 he had eaten, minus the 6 condemned. 183. If he ate 2 tins a day and gave Brindle 1, that was 3 tins daily. 61 days of food. More than 2 months. But this math was wrong, and he knew it. He could not eat only tinned food for 2 months. He would need water, snow melt. He would need to keep the candles burning for the hours of inventory and sorting that still remained. He would need to leave the vault to tend juniper, and every trip outside would cost heat and strength. And if the storm lasted a week, or 2, or 3, if this was the winter everyone feared, 61 days might not be generous at all. He rationed. He carved a mark into the plank beside his bed with a dull knife. 1 mark for each day. 1 line beneath it for each tin consumed. The system was crude. It was enough. That first night in the vault, Tilden did not sleep so much as he stopped moving. He lay on the plank platform in 2 coats with Brindle pressed against his chest and the candle burning low on a shelf near his head, and he listened to the vault breathe. The vent pipe whispered. The door gap sighed. Above, the storm roared across the ruins of gray quartz with a sound like a locomotive running on no rails, and the burned walls caught the wind and threw it in directions that made the old stovepipes scream. The vault's temperature held. Not warm. Tilden's breath still made clouds, but the stone walls radiated a cold that was 30 degrees gentler than the air outside, and the earth packed around the foundation acted as insulation the way Pater had described, holding yesterday's temperature, resisting today's assault. The thermometer Tilden did not have would have read perhaps 28 or 30 degrees inside the vault. Cold enough to keep the tin stable, warm enough to keep a man's blood moving if he had wool and wood and a dog. At some point in the night, Brindle shifted and pressed his nose against Tilden's throat, and Tilden felt the dog's heartbeat against his own, and for the first time since Pollard's speech in the hay barn, the panic in his chest loosened enough to let him close his eyes. He dreamed of Pater Vangin kneeling beside a wall, tapping brick with his mason's hammer, listening. Morning was a word that had no meaning underground. Tilden woke because Brindle stood up on the platform and whined at the door. The candle had burned out. The darkness was total. He struck his fifth match, one left, and lit the second candle stub. Then he faced the day. Juniper. He climbed the stairs and pushed through the board and snow windbreak he had built over the stairwell opening. The world above was white and screaming. The storm had not stopped. If anything, the wind was stronger, and the snow had changed from the dry powder of the night before to hard, small pellets that stung his face and collected in the folds of his coat like shot. Juniper stood behind the chimney stack where Tilden had tied him. The horse was alive. That was the best thing Tilden could say. The animal stood with its head below its knees, its coat crusted with ice and snow, its legs buried to the hocks in drift. The feed bag was empty. The oats were gone. Tilden tried to lead the horse down the stairwell. He pulled. He coaxed. He put his shoulder against Juniper's chest and pushed. The horse planted its feet at the top step and rolled its eyes until the whites showed. Horses will not descend into dark holes. 1,000 years of instinct told Juniper that a hole in the ground meant death, and no amount of human persuasion would override 1,000 years. He could not bring the horse underground. The horse could not survive above ground for long. The wind was stripping heat from the animal faster than Juniper's failing body could replace it. Tilden built a windbreak. He pulled the two largest intact shutters from the burned hotel, heavy pine frames with iron hinges, charred on one side but solid, and dragged them to the chimney stack. He braced them against the chimney's standing walls and packed snow along the base. The result was a three-sided shelter, open on the lee side, with the chimney stack blocking the worst of the north wind. It was not warm. It was less cold. The difference for a horse might be life. He spread the last of the oats on a flat board inside the windbreak. Juniper ate with the mechanical focus of an animal operating on instinct alone. When the oats were gone, the horse stood still and waited for more. There were no more. Tilden descended back into the vault and began the work that would determine whether he lived or died in this room. The inventory took most of the day. He worked by candlelight, sorting tins into rows on the shelves. He tapped each one with his knuckle the way Pater tapped brick, listening for the ring of sound metal, the dull thud of compromised seams. He set the doubtful ones apart. He grouped by type where labels survived: tomatoes, beans, salmon, peaches, condensed milk, flour, coffee. The hardtack boxes he opened one at a time, checking for mold or moisture. The hardtack was dark, dense, and dry. It would break a tooth if a man was not careful, but it would not kill him. The flour tins were the most valuable and the most dangerous. Flour in a sealed tin might keep for years, or it might harbor weevils that had been sealed in with it. He opened one and found flour, gray-white, dry, with a faint smell of metal from the tin. No movement, no weevils visible in the candlelight. He tasted a pinch, flat, stale, but sound. He sealed it again by pressing the lid tight and setting a brick on top. By afternoon, he was guessing at time based on his own hunger cycle. He had sorted 196 sound tins, including the 5 additional ones he had reevaluated after tapping. 37 tins of tomatoes, 29 of beans, 22 of salmon, 18 of peaches, 14 of condensed milk, 9 of coffee, 8 of corned beef, 7 of flour, 6 miscellaneous browse, sardines, tongue, a tin marked only with a stamp he could not read. 46 tins he could not identify because the labels had disintegrated or been removed. He would open those last one by one as needed. He marked the inventory on the inside of the ledger cover with a pencil stub he found in the coat pocket. The numbers sat on the page like a promise he was afraid to trust. The memory of Peder Vangen came back to Tilden not in one piece but in fragments, the way lessons return when the body needs them more than the mind can summon them. The previous autumn, at the spring house south of the Judith Basin, Peder had worked for 3 days repairing the collapsed roof and cracked foundation. Tilden had stayed because the work was honest, and Peder paid in meals and knowledge, which was better currency than Merryweather's promises. On the second day, Peder had taken Tilden into the cellar beneath the spring house and taught him 3 things. The first was draft reading, which Tilden had already used. The candle flame test. Air moves from warm to cold, and if you can see it moving, the room is alive. The second was masonry listening. Peder picked up his mason's hammer, a short-handled tool with a flat head on one side and a chisel point on the other, and tapped the cellar wall in a slow rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Each strike rang differently depending on what lay behind the brick. Solid earth returned a dead sound. Empty space returned a hollow ring, faintly resonant, like a note played on a drum with a hole in it. Peder said, "A mason builds the wall. The wall remembers what the mason put behind it. Tap, and the wall will tell you." He tapped 3 feet to the right. The sound changed. He said, "There. That is where the drain pipe runs. I did not need to see the plans. The brick told me." Tilden had used this skill in the vault without consciously deciding to. When he tapped tins, he was listening the same way, for the sound that meant solid and the sound that meant empty or compromised. Peder's lesson had entered his hands before his mind caught up. The third skill was cold floor management, which he had already applied with the plank platform, but Peder had added a detail Tilden only now remembered. Peder had said, "The cold rises from stone. It does not fall from air. A man in a cellar wraps his blanket around his shoulders and freezes from below. Turn the blanket under you. Your shoulders can wait. Your kidneys cannot." Tilden rearranged his bedding. He folded the canvas under the planks rather than over them, creating a double layer between his body and the stone. The difference was small. At 3 in the morning, small differences are the ones that keep a man from shaking himself apart. On the second day, Tilden performed the tests. He placed 1 tin of tomatoes just inside the door gap, where outside air leaked in. He placed another against the back wall, where the earth held the vault's temperature steady. He left them overnight. By the time he checked, his hunger told him morning, though the darkness told him nothing. The door tin was frozen solid, ice crystals visible on the seam. The back wall tin was cold, but the content shifted when he tilted it. Not frozen. The vault's temperature gradient ran from near killing at the door to merely uncomfortable at the back wall. He moved his platform to the back corner, farthest from the door, and stacked crates along the wall between his bed and the entrance to create a barrier against the creeping cold. He tested the vent again. He twisted a strip of paper into a tight coil, lit the end with the candle, and held the smoking twist near the vent pipe. The smoke crawled upward into the pipe and vanished. Draft was moving. The vent was clear. Pater's warning returned, spoken in the old man's careful English with its Norwegian edges. A man in a hole must fear comfort. Comfort makes him stop checking the air. Tilden made a rule. Every time he ate, he checked the vent. Smoke goes up, he lives. Smoke pools, he leaves. The rule was simple enough to follow when exhaustion blurred everything else. The morning of the third day, the storm stopped. It did not taper. It stopped. 1 hour the wind was tearing at the stairwell boards, and the next hour the world above was silent. Tilden climbed out and stood in the ruins of gray quartz, under a sky so clear the stars cut the dark like needle points. The temperature had dropped. He could feel it in his nostrils, the burn of air so cold it crackled when he breathed. He found Juniper alive behind the shutters. The horse's legs had stiffened. The windbreak had held. Juniper pressed his muzzle against Tilden's chest and breathed hot air through the flour sack cloth. The horse needed food Tilden did not have. The oats were gone. There was nothing above ground to eat. Tilden considered leaving. The sky was clear. If the road was passable, he could ride for the relay station. 28 miles from the stage stable, but fewer from here. Maybe 14, maybe 12, depending on how far the mining road had carried him before he turned off. Then he looked north. The sky above the northern horizon was not clear. It was a wall, green-gray, thick, moving toward him, with the slow certainty of something that does not need to hurry because it knows it will arrive. The clear sky was not mercy. It was the eye of the system. The break between the first storm and the second. The pellets would return. The wind would return. And when they did, the second storm would be worse than the first, because the first storm had laid a base of packed snow that the second would build upon. And the drifts that were 4 feet deep would become 8, and the temperature that had hovered near 0 would drop to 20 below. Tilden went back underground. He sealed the stairwell boards tighter. He packed snow around the windbreak for Juniper. He lit the candle and counted tins again, because counting was the only thing that made the math feel real instead of imagined. 193 tins. He had eaten 3 in 2 days. Brindle had shared 2. The rate was sustainable. The question was not food. The question was how long the vault would hold against a storm that had not yet shown its full weight. He heard the wind begin at sunset. It did not arrive. It appeared all at once, as if someone had opened a door between the world and the worst thing in it. At dusk on the third day, Tilden saw the lantern. He had climbed the stairs to check on Juniper one last time before the second storm closed the world. The wind was already screaming, the snow already horizontal, and visibility had dropped to the length of his arm. He was turning back toward the stairwell when he saw it, a yellow smear of light swinging erratically 50 yards beyond the ruins, moving toward him. He watched it for 10 seconds. The light dipped, rose, dipped again. It moved the way a man moves when he is staggering. Brindle saw it too. The dog stood at the top of the stairs and barked once, saw him. The stranger bark. Then the dog sniffed the wind and stopped barking. Not a stranger. Something familiar. The lantern resolved into a hand, then an arm, then a man. Merritt Klein stumbled through the gap in the livery wall and fell face first into the snow. Merritt was not leading a horse. He was not carrying a pack. He was wearing a coat crusted with ice so thick it had turned rigid, and his right hand, the one not holding the lantern, was bare. The glove was gone. The hand was the color of old wax. Tilden dragged him behind the chimney stack and out of the wind. Merritt's eyes were open but unfocused. His lips were moving. The words came out in pieces, broken by the chattering of his teeth. Road, closed, turned back, lost the horse, fell in a coulee. Merritt Klein, the practical skeptic, the man who had mocked Tilden for trusting a dog's nose and an old Norwegian's lessons, had tried the main road anyway. He had ignored Asa's warning the same way Tilden had, but he had ignored it in the direction of conventional wisdom. He had taken the known road, the maintained road, the road that every reasonable man would choose, and the road had tried to kill him. Tilden said, "Can you walk?" Merritt said, "I walked 9 miles to get here." Tilden said, "Then walk 12 more steps. They go down." He got Merritt to the stairwell. The steps were the hardest part. Merritt's legs buckled on the third tread, and Tilden caught him by the back of his coat and lowered him step by step, the way a man lowers a sack of grain that might tear. Brindle went ahead, barking the calling bark, leading them down. They reached the vault door. Tilden had widened the gap to nearly 8 inches with repeated levering over the past 2 days, but Merritt could not turn sideways. His frozen coat was too stiff, his body too rigid with cold. Tilden stripped the outer coat off him, and the sound it made was like tearing bark from a tree. Merritt cried out once, then he went through the gap. Inside the vault, in candlelight, Tilden saw how close to dead Merritt was. His face was gray. His right hand, the bare one, had fingers the color of tallow, stiff, bloodless. His left hand was better, protected by a glove, but the fingertips were white. His cough was deep and wet, the kind of cough that comes from lungs that have been breathing ice crystals for hours. Tilden worked from Pater's principles, even though Pater had never taught him how to warm a dying man in a bank vault. He stripped Merritt's wet inner shirt and wrapped him in the bank clerk's coat. He heated stones, flat pieces of dressed stone, pulled from a crumbled section of the vault wall, by placing them near the candle flame for an hour, then wrapping them in canvas and pressing them against Merritt's chest and sides. The stones were barely warm. The warmth was barely enough. But the vault's ambient temperature did the rest. Underground, insulated from wind, the air was cold but not killing. He fed Merritt condensed milk thinned with snow melt, a tin he had filled with clean snow from the stairwell and let melt inside the vault overnight. Merritt drank in small sips, gagging at first, then swallowing with the desperate mechanical rhythm of a man whose body is overriding his will. Merritt reached for the shelf. He saw the tins. He said, "Open, open more. I need to eat." Tilden said, "Not yet." Merritt said, "I am starving." Tilden said, "You are cold. Cold feels like hunger. If you eat too fast, you will vomit, and we cannot waste food or water." Merritt looked at him. In the candlelight, with his gray face and his wax-colored fingers and his pride stripped away like the frozen coat, Merritt looked like a man seeing someone clearly for the first time. He said, "How do you know that?" Tilden said, "A man told me." He did not say Pater's name. He did not explain. He opened 1 tin of beans and fed Merritt half, 1 spoonful at a time, using the pry bar's flat end as a spoon. He fed Brindle the other half. He ate nothing himself, because the vault now held 2 men and a dog, and the survival math had changed. 190 tins. 3 tins a day for 2 men and a dog. 63 days. But Merritt ate more than Tilden. His body demanded fuel to fight the cold it had absorbed. so the real rate would be closer to 4 tins daily. 47 days. Enough, maybe. If the winter broke in time. But food was not the only math that had changed. Air had changed. 2 men breathe more than one. 2 men produce more moisture, more heat, more carbon. The vault's vent pipe and door gap had sustained 1 man and 1 dog. Whether they could sustain 2 men and 1 dog through continuous confinement was a question Tilden could not answer with a candle flame. He checked the vent. Smoke still crawled upward. The flame still leaned. The room still breathed. But the candle seemed to dim faster than before, and whether that was the candle burning short or the air growing thin, Tilden could not tell. He opened the door gap wider, another 2 inches, using the wagon tongue in the dark while Merritt slept. The snow was already packing against the stairwell boards above. Each inch of open door meant more cold air entering the vault, which meant lower temperature, which meant burning more of his body's fuel to stay warm. The trade-off was brutal. Freeze slowly with good air or suffocate slowly in warmth. He chose air. Peter would have chosen air. A sealed room without draft is a coffin. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens next tests everything Tilden has built, everything Peter taught him, and the one bond no blizzard can explain. Subscribe and stay, because the worst of this winter has not yet arrived. The second storm buried gray quartz, not gradually, not in stages. The wind came back as if it had been holding its breath, and the snow fell so thick that standing in the stairwell at arm's length from the boards, Tilden could not see the boards. The world above became a white void with no ground, no sky, no direction. Sound itself changed. The wind was so loud and so constant that it stopped being sound and became pressure, a physical weight against the ears and chest. Tilden lost Juniper on the second night of the renewed storm. He had gone up to check the horse at what he guessed was late afternoon. Juniper was still behind the shutters, but the windbreak was failing. One shutter had cracked along the charred edge, and snow was pouring through the break. Tilden tried to brace it. The wind tore the shutter from his hands and flung it into the dark. He heard it hit something and shatter. Juniper screamed. The horse reared, snapped the reins from the chimney stack, and bolted. Not in any direction Tilden could follow. Into the white. Into the nothing. The sound of hooves on frozen ground lasted 3 seconds, and then the wind took even that. Tilden turned toward the stairwell. He could not see it. He had walked 12 steps from the door gap and could not find his way back. The ruins, the chimney stacks, the standing walls, all invisible. The snow was above his knees and climbing. His hand swept the air in front of him and found nothing. Brindle saved him. The dog barked from the stairwell, not once, continuously. A steady rhythm of sound that cut through the wind the way a bell cuts through fog, not louder than the storm, but different from it, a frequency the human ear tracks even when the brain has stopped processing. Tilden followed the sound on his hands and knees. He crawled until his hand hit the stairwell board, and then he pulled the board aside and fell down the stairs and lay on the landing with snow melting in his hair and his hands shaking so violently he could not close them into fists. Juniper was gone. He lay on the landing and felt the loss like a physical wound. A horse he had ridden for 9 months, an animal that had carried him through country no man should cross alone. Gone into the whiteout to die in a drift or a coulee. Legs broken, lungs frozen. Tilden had brought the horse here, and the horse had trusted him, and the trust had meant nothing because a man cannot save everything and the storm does not negotiate. Brindle came to the landing and licked the snow from Tilden's face. Tilden wrapped his arms around the dog and held on for a count of 10. Then he went back underground. The days inside the vault collapsed into a rhythm that was not life, but not yet death. Tilden counted them by ration marks on the plank. Merritt slept for most of the first 3 days, waking only to eat and drink and cough. His right hand began to blister as feeling returned. Not a good sign. The white fingers turned red, then purple, then 2 fingertips on the smallest, and ring fingers went black. Merritt stared at them with a look that was not pain, but understanding. He would lose them. He knew. Tilden knew. Neither of them said it. Tilden checked the vent every time he ate. Smoke up, air moving, alive. On the 4th day of confinement, he heard the vent change. The whisper of moving air, which had been constant since he cleared the pipe, dropped in pitch and then stopped. He held the paper twist to the pipe. The smoke pooled at the opening and curled back into the vault. The vent was icing shut. Tilden's hands went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The vent was icing because warm vault air rose through the pipe, hit the frozen outside end, and deposited moisture that froze on the inner wall. Over days, the ice thickened. Eventually, it would seal the pipe entirely. Without the vent, the vault would rely solely on the door gap for fresh air, and the door gap was packing with snow from above. He had to clear the pipe from below. He could not climb through the rubble to find the outside opening. The storm made that suicidal. He had to work from inside, pushing upward through a 2-inch pipe clogged with ice. He tied the dull knife to the end of a slat with a strip of rawhide. The blade was narrow enough to enter the pipe. He pushed it upward, working by feel, scraping ice from the walls of the vent. Ice chips fell on his face. He pushed deeper. The slat flexed, then jammed. He pulled back, repositioned, pushed again. His shoulders burned from holding his arms above his head. His fingers, already split and raw, bled onto the rawhide binding. The blockage broke. He felt it give, a sudden release of resistance, followed by a faint, cold whistle of air entering the pipe from outside. He pulled the slat free and held the paper twist to the vent. Smoke crawled upward and vanished. Merritt, watching from the plank bed, said, "How did you know to do that?" Tilden said, "A man told me to fear comfort. Comfort makes you stop checking the air." Merritt said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You're not lucky, Rusk. I thought you were lucky. You are not." After 5 days of confinement, Tilden and Merritt crawled up the stairs during a lull and explored the edge of the ruins. They found an overturned freighter's sled near the assay office, half buried in a drift 8 feet deep. One dead mule lay in the traces, drifted over, preserved by the cold. The mule's harness was still buckled. The freighter was gone. They searched for 30 minutes in bitter cold and found one mitten frozen to a fence wire near the road. The fingers inside the mitten were still in the mitten. There was no hand attached. Merritt looked at the mitten and looked at his own blackened fingertips and did not speak. This was what conventional movement had accomplished. A man with a sled and a mule and a road had died within 100 yards of a town. A man with a dog and a hole had lived. Orrin Voss arrived on the 8th day. Tilden heard the voices before he saw the men. He was at the top of the stairwell clearing fresh snow from the boards when the wind carried fragments of speech, 2 voices, maybe 3, coming from the south end of the ruins. He pulled back behind the chimney stack and watched. 3 figures emerged from the blowing snow. Voss was in front, hunched against the wind, holding a folded paper in one hand, the map. Behind him, 2 men Tilden did not recognize. One was walking normally. The other was limping, his right arm held against his chest, his face twisted. Voss saw the chimney stack. He saw the cleared area around the stairwell. He saw the tracks Tilden had left coming and going over the past week. He stopped and smiled the same smile Tilden had seen at the stage stable, thin, unmoving at the eyes. Voss said, "I told you the bank had a basement." The words were directed not at Tilden, but at the men behind him. Voss had known. He had carried the map of gray quartz since before Tilden left the stable. He had waited for the storm to drive Tilden into the dead town, or he had followed afterward, knowing that a desperate man with a dog might find what a careful man with a map could claim. Tilden said, "There is no money down there." Voss said, "I did not say money." He stepped closer. His coat was better than Tilden's, fur-lined, tight at the wrists, the coat of a man who made money from other men's ruin. He said, "The contents of that vault are property of the Gray Quartz Mining Company, held in receivership. I hold the paper on 6 outstanding claims against the company estate. Anything in that vault, provisions, equipment, documents, falls under receivable assets." Tilden said, "Those provisions kept me alive." Voss said, "Then you owe the estate for their use." The injured man, later Tilden would learn his name was Pike, coughed and swayed on his feet. His arm was wrong, broken at the forearm maybe, or dislocated at the shoulder. His face was white under a week of stubble. He had not eaten recently. That was visible in the way his cheeks pulled inward and his eyes sat deep. Tilden said, "The vault is shelter. There is food. But no one enters armed and no one eats until inventory is confirmed." Voss said, "I will enter as I please. The property is mine." Tilden said, "The property is underground. The entrance is here. I control the entrance." Voss reached inside his coat. The other man, the one not injured, shifted his weight in a way that meant he was carrying something too. Tilden said, "You fire a shot near that stairwell. You collapse the brick arch. You collapse the arch. Nobody gets in. Not me. Not you. Not him." He pointed at Calder. "And the food stays buried for another 3 years." Voss held still. The wind screamed through the ruins. Pike looked at the stairwell, looked at Voss, and then did something that changed the geometry of the standoff entirely. He dropped his pistol in the snow. The gun hit the ground with a muffled thud. Calder looked at Tilden and said, "I'm too cold and too hungry to shoot anyone. Let me in, and I will do whatever you say." He did not wait for Voss's permission. He stumbled forward, reached the stairwell, and lowered himself down the steps one at a time, using his good arm. Brindle sniffed him at the door gap and did not growl. Voss said, "Pike, you come back here." Calder did not come back. Tilden looked at Voss. He said, "Disarmed, one at a time, no fire in the vault, no touching tins before inventory. Those are the rules." Voss said, "I do not accept your rules." Tilden said, "Then stay outside." He descended the stairs. Behind him, he heard Voss speak to the remaining man. The words were lost in the wind, but the tone was clear. Anger compressed into a whisper, the sound of a man who is used to controlling rooms and has just been locked out of one. The storm returned harder that night. The temperature dropped so far that the moisture in the stairwell air froze into crystals that hung suspended, visible in the candle's glow when Tilden climbed to check. By morning, Voss's second man had vanished, fled into the storm, or frozen somewhere in the ruins. Tilden did not search for him. He could not search for him. The blizzard would not permit it. Voss appeared at the top of the stairwell at midday, alone. His fur-lined coat was white with packed snow. His lips were cracked. His hands shook. He stood at the top step and said nothing. He did not demand. He did not claim rights. He stood and shook and said nothing. Tilden climbed the stairs and said, "Gun!" Voss pulled a revolver from his coat and held it out. His hand trembled so badly the barrel waved in small circles. Tilden took it. The metal was so cold it burned his palm. Tilden said, "Down." Voss went down. Inside the vault, the population had risen to 3 men and 1 dog in a space 12 feet by 10. The air was thinner. The vent required clearing twice a day now, instead of once. Tilden rationed harder. 2 tins per man per day, 1 for Brindle, with condensed milk and snowmelt distributed equally. Voss ate in silence. He did not thank anyone. He did not apologize. He ate and slept and stared at the shelves with the expression of a man calculating value even while his life was being saved. Calder Pike's arm was broken above the wrist. Merritt, who had set bones on cattle drives, splinted it with slat wood and strips of oilcloth. Calder screamed once. Then he passed out. When he woke, he asked Tilden how the food had stayed good for 3 years. Tilden said, "The room was sealed. The tins were sealed. The temperature stayed constant. Nothing got in." Calder said, "How did you know it would be here?" Tilden said, "I did not know. The dog knew." Brindle lay in the corner of the vault, ears flat, watching Voss the way a dog watches a snake, not with aggression, but with the kind of patience that precedes aggression if the snake moves wrong. The storm held for 6 more days. Tilden counted them on the plank. He cleared the vent twice each day. He distributed food in the morning and evening. He checked the door gap for snow intrusion and packed it back. He fed Brindle salmon and beans and scraped the tins clean before stacking them in a separate crate so the count stayed accurate. 196 sound tins at the start. By the time outside travel became possible, the count had dropped to 123. 3 men and 1 dog for 12 days in a room built to hold money, not men. Merritt lost 2 fingertips on his right hand. They blackened and dried, and eventually he cut them away himself with Tilden's knife, heated over the candle flame. He did not scream. He bit down on a strip of oilcloth and breathed through his nose, and the sound he made was the sound of a man discovering what he is willing to lose in order to keep the rest. The air held. The food held. The vent held because Tilden never stopped checking it, never let comfort convince him the room would breathe on its own. 3 times the vent iced shut. 3 times he cleared it with the knife and slat. The 4th time, he pushed a strip of the rifle cleaning rag into the pipe and left it dangling so the cloth would wick moisture before it froze on the pipe walls. The fix was imperfect. It was enough. Voss slept 15 hours a day and spoke no more than 10 words to anyone. Calder asked Tilden questions about the tins, the vent, the temperature, the plank bed. Merritt watched Tilden work and said nothing, but his silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of a man who thinks someone is a fool. It was the silence of a man revising a judgment he had been confident about. On the 12th day, the storm broke. The wind dropped. The sky cleared. Tilden climbed the stairs and found the entrance buried. The stairwell was packed with drift snow from the last 6 days of storm. The boards he had placed as a windbreak were gone, blown away, or buried. Snow filled the stair from the landing to a level 3 feet above his head. Solid, packed, wind-hammered snow. Below, in the vault, 3 men and a dog waited. The air was still moving through the vent. They would not suffocate immediately, but the door gap was now sealed under the drift, which meant the vent was the only air source, and 1 2-inch vent pipe could not sustain 3 men indefinitely. Tilden took the crate boards from the vault. He took the pry bar. He climbed to the landing and began digging upward. Merritt joined him with a plank. Calder used his good hand and a tin lid. They dug in shifts, two digging while one rested, passing the loosened snow down the stairs in crate lids used as shovels. The snow was dense. The work was slow. Tilden's arms trembled after 20 minutes. Merritt lasted 15. Calder lasted 10 before the pain in his broken arm stopped him. Brindle did not dig at the snow. Brindle went to the vent pipe. The dog stood beneath the pipe, nose lifted, nostrils flaring. Then the dog barked. The calling bark. The one that meant something worth finding. Tilden stopped digging and watched. Brindle scratched at the wall beneath the vent. The dog was tracking the air. The vent led to the surface. The surface was closer at the vent outlet than at the stairwell opening because the vent pipe ran through the upper wall at an angle, exiting somewhere in the rubble above the vault. Rubble that might have less accumulated drift than the exposed stairwell. Tilden pressed his ear to the vent pipe. He could hear wind, not the muffled sound of wind through feet of snow, open wind, close. He climbed the stairs, turned toward the wall where the vent ran, and dug laterally instead of vertically. 2 feet of packed snow, then rubble, then a gap in the collapsed wall where the vent pipe emerged into open air. The drift here was thinner. The rubble had created an eddy that kept the snow from packing as tightly. He broke through with the pry bar and felt wind on his face and saw a light so bright it made him cry. The sky was blue. The temperature was murderous. The world was white in every direction, featureless, empty, silent. But they were out. Merritt came through the gap next, then Calder, then Voss, who said nothing as he emerged into the light. Brindle pushed through last, shook snow from his coat, and stood in the ruins of gray quartz, with his torn ear cocked toward the wind and his nose working. The dog had led them in. The dog's instinct had led them out. Tilden stood in the snow with cracked hands and a split boot sole, and a face so gaunt the bones showed through the skin, and he looked at the empty white plain where a town had once stood, and a storm had tried to kill him, and he did not feel relief. Relief would come later, when the shaking stopped. What he felt was simpler and harder to name. He felt the weight of the mason's hammer in the handle grooves. He felt the candle lean. The relief party arrived 3 days after the survivors emerged from the vault. Tilden had expected no one. He had assumed the world beyond gray quartz, had forgotten the dead town and everyone in it. He had spent those 3 days in a shallow routine, descending into the vault to eat, climbing out to scan the horizon, checking on Merritt's hand and Calder's arm, avoiding Voss. The sky stayed clear. The temperature stayed brutal, and the snow lay so deep across the benches that walking 50 yards required the effort of walking 500. Brindle heard them first. The dog lifted his head from the snow where he had been resting in the lee of the chimney stack and pointed his ears south. A low whine, then the stranger bark, but only once, and then silence, which meant the dog had caught a scent he recognized. Tilden climbed the tallest standing wall and shielded his eyes. 6 riders, moving in single file along the mining road, their horses chest-deep in drift, breaking trail with the slow, brutal rhythm of men who had been riding through packed snow for hours. The lead horse carried a man with a wide hat and a straight back, and even at a quarter mile Tilden knew the posture. Asa Trask. Asa reached the ruins at mid-afternoon. He dismounted stiffly, tied his horse to a standing door frame, and stood in the ruined main street of gray quartz, looking at the cleared stairwell, the windbreak shutters still standing by the chimney stack, and the trampled snow around the bank foundation. He looked at Tilden, who was standing at the top of the stairs with Brindle beside him. He looked at Merritt, who stood behind Tilden with his right hand wrapped in cloth. He looked at Calder, whose arm hung in a sling made from oilcloth. He looked at Voss, who sat on a broken wall 10 yards away and said nothing. Asa said, "I came for bodies." Tilden said, "No bodies." Asa's jaw worked. He crossed the snow to the stairwell and looked down. The stairs descended into shadow. The vault door, still wedged open, was visible at the bottom, a dark rectangle framed in blackened brick. Cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of tin and dry paper and the faint sourness of men who had lived underground for 12 days. Asa descended. Tilden followed. In the candlelight, the last candle stub, burning short, Asa Trask saw the vault. He saw the shelves with their remaining tins sorted into rows. He saw the vent pipe with the cleaning rag dangling from it, the ice scrape marks visible on the iron. He saw the plank platform with its canvas and paper bedding. He saw the ration marks scratched into the plank, 12 lines, each one scored deep enough to feel in the dark. He saw the condemned tins bulged, leaking, rusted through, stacked separately in a corner with a brick placed on top like a headstone. He looked at each thing for a long time. He touched the vent pipe. He put his hand against the back wall and held it there, the way Tilden had once held his hand against the root cellar wall while Pater watched. Asa said, "I told you a dog does not find mercy under ashes." Tilden waited. Asa pulled his hand from the wall and turned to face him. In the candlelight, the old stock inspector's face was carved deep with lines that looked like they had been put there by decades of weather and one morning of being wrong. He said, "I was wrong about the dog. I was wrong about the ashes. I was wrong about you." He did not say it gently. He said it the way a man states a fact he has verified, tripuit, flatly, without apology, because the fact does not require embellishment. Asa Trask had spent 40 years learning to read animals, weather, and men, and he had misread all three when he watched Tilden ride out of the stage stable. The admission cost him something. Tilden could see the cost in the way Asa's mouth compressed after the words came out, as if the jaw wanted to take them back, but the brain would not permit it. Tilden said, "You were not wrong about the road. The road would have killed me." Asa looked at him sharply. "Then why did you take it?" "I took the mining road, not the main road. And I did not mean to stop here. The dog stopped here. I followed the dog." Asa climbed back up the stairs without another word. At the top, he stood in the wind and looked at Brindle, who was sitting in the snow with his torn ear cocked and his paws raw, and his tail moving very slightly, the way a dog's tail moves when it recognizes someone who once dismissed it. Asa said, to no one in particular, the dog smelled something under the snow that 4 men could not see standing on top of it. The relief party had ridden from a ranch settlement east of the Mussel Shell. They brought reports, and the reports were a catalog of ruin. The killing winter of 1887 had done what no single storm could do. It had broken the open range. Cattle drifted south with the wind until fences or coulees stopped them, and there they piled up and froze. One rancher south of the Judith lost 4,000 head. Another found his herd pressed against a cut bank, stacked 3 deep, all dead. Cowboys in line shacks survived if the shacks held, and starved if they did not. Freighters on the roads died when their teams failed. 2 men in a cabin near Flat Willow Creek had burned every piece of furniture, every floorboard, and the cabin door itself before the relief rider found them crouched over coals in a roofless shell. Against this, Tilden's vault stood as an anomaly that no one could easily explain. A man with a dog had stumbled into a dead town, and survived underground on food that had been forgotten for 3 years. The men in the relief party walked through the ruins, examined the stairwell, looked into the vault, and asked questions, not with mockery, but with the careful attention of men who had spent the winter wondering whether they were going to die. Tilden did not boast. He showed them the discarded tins first, the bulged ones, the leaking ones, the rusted through ones. He picked up a condemned tin and held it so the riders could see the swollen top, the seam dark with oxidation. He said, "The food that kills looks almost exactly like the food that saves. The only difference is this." He pressed the top with his thumb. The metal flexed. A good tin does not flex. If it gives, you throw it away. It does not matter how hungry you are. Then he showed them the vent. He pointed to the scrape marks on the inside of the pipe. He showed them the knife on slat tool he had used to clear it. He said, "A room underground will keep you warm enough to live, but it will also keep your breath inside long enough to kill you. If you cannot feel air moving, you leave. You do not guess. You do not hope. You leave." Then the plank bed, the raised platform, the canvas, the dead airspace between wood and stone. He said, "Cold does not fall from the ceiling. Cold rises from the floor. Put wood between you and the ground, and you can sleep. Put only blankets, and the stone will drink your heat through them before morning." Then the ration marks, 12 lines on the plank, 12 days. He said, "Count before you eat. Eat after you count. If you eat first, you have already lost." The riders listened. 2 of them took notes on paper they carried in their saddlebags. One man, a young cowhand named Jocelyn, went back down into the vault 3 times to study the vent pipe, running his fingers along the scrape marks the way Tilden had once run his fingers along the root cellar wall. Merritt stood beside Tilden during the demonstrations. He did not speak much. When Jocelyn asked how Merritt had survived, Merritt said, "I tried the road. The road nearly killed me. Rusk tried the hole. The hole saved us both." Calder Pike said less, but when Voss attempted to pull one of the relief riders aside to discuss the legal status of the vault provisions, Calder stepped between them. He looked at Voss and said, "You valued that property until the weather made you its beggar." He said it loudly enough for every man present to hear. Voss turned away. He did not argue. He could not argue, because every man in the relief party could see the same thing. Voss had arrived at the vault armed, had tried to claim provisions by force, had been refused entry on those terms, and had eventually been reduced to crawling down the stairs like the men he had tried to exploit. But Voss was not finished. Voss was patient, and patient men with paper do not need arguments when they have courts. Peter Vangen arrived with a second group of riders 2 days after Asa's party. Tilden was boiling snowmelt over a small fire, the first open fire he had lit since entering the vault, built outside on the cleared stone foundation because Peter's rule about sealed rooms still held even though the crisis had passed. He heard hooves and looked up and saw a man on a short-legged sorrel mare, riding slowly, hunched forward in the saddle in a way that could mean cold, or could mean pain, or could mean age catching up to a body that had refused to acknowledge it. Peter dismounted. He moved stiffly. His bad eye was worse, clouded nearly white, weeping in the cold. His hands, gray with morite dust that seemed to be permanent, trembled on the reins. He had been delayed at a ranch 2 days east, repairing a chimney that had cracked in the freeze, and he had feared Tilden dead the entire time. He had ridden through conditions that a man 30 years younger would have called impossible, because the alternative was not knowing. He said nothing to Tilden. He walked past him, past Brindle, past the fire, and descended the stairs. Tilden followed. In the vault, Peter Vangen moved the way he moved in any masonry space, slowly, touching walls, listening. He put his hand against the brick. He tapped it once with his knuckle and listened to the ring. He ran his fingers along the vent pipe and found the scrape marks where Tilden had cleared the ice. He bent down and touched the plank platform, the canvas, the dead air gap beneath it. He did not speak for a long time. The candle stub was nearly gone. In its failing light, Pater's face looked like the stone he had spent his life working, lined, gray, carved by forces that did not care about the shape they left behind. Then he straightened. He put one hand on Tilden's shoulder. His grip was not strong. The strength that had once lifted lintel stones had gone somewhere Tilden could not follow. But it was deliberate. The weight of it said what Pater's English could not manage. Tilden said, "I used what you taught me." Pater said, "I can see that." He paused. "You added things I did not teach. The rag in the vent pipe, that was mine." Pater nodded. "The student solves what the teacher did not imagine. That is how knowledge survives." They stood together in the vault, the old mason and the cowboy who had learned to read stone and air, and the relationship between them shifted in a way that neither of them named. Pater was no longer the teacher who gave knowledge and received respect. Tilden was no longer the student who took lessons and returned labor. They stood now as men who shared a language that most people could not hear, the language of masonry and draft and temperature, and the difference between a room that breathes and a room that kills. Pater had spoken it first. Tilden had spoken it back, under conditions Pater had never tested. The old man looked at the ration marks on the plank. 12 lines. 12 days underground. He touched the 12th line with his finger and held it there. He said, "My father told me that a mason's best work is the work no one sees, the foundation, the drainage, the vent, the things that keep the building alive while everyone admires the walls." He looked at Tilden. "You did not build walls, Tilden. You kept the building alive." Spring came the way it always came to Montana territory, late, grudging, and untrustworthy. The snow did not melt so much as it compressed, turning from powder to crust to gray slush that refroze every night and melted again every afternoon. The rivers broke their ice in March with sounds like cannon fire, and the flooding that followed carried dead cattle downstream in quantities that made the water undrinkable for miles. Tilden did not go to Helena immediately. Annie's letter burned in his hatband, but the roads were impassable for weeks after the thaw began, and Pater needed help with a project that could not wait. The project was Pater's idea, born from the vault. He said, "You survived because you found one room. The next man may not find one, so we will mark them." They began in April. Tilden on Juniper's replacement, a stocky dun mare named Flint, traded from the relief party for labor, and Pater on his sorrel. They rode the routes between the Musselshell and the Judith, between the stage stops and the ranch settlements, between the places where men traveled in winter and the places where men died trying. They were looking for rooms, not houses, not cabins, not buildings with walls and roofs that the wind could take. They were looking for what the earth held, root cellars dug into hillsides, stone milk houses half buried in creek banks, mine powder magazines with brick walls and iron doors, old dugouts with sod roofs and stone floors, spring houses, smokehouse foundations, any masonry or earth-sheltered space where a man caught in a storm could descend below the wind and survive. They found 23 in 3 weeks of riding. Not all were usable. Some had collapsed, some flooded in the thaw. Some had no ventilation and would kill a man as surely as the storm outside. But 14 were sound, and those 14 became the first marked shelters on the winter routes. Pater made the signs. He cut tin from empty cans, the condemned tins from the vault, flattened and nailed to wooden stakes, and scratched the rules into the metal with a nail. Check air before sleep. Raise bedding off stone. Do not burn fire in sealed rooms. Discard swollen tins. Leave more than you take when you can. Tilden set the stakes at each shelter entrance and cached supplies inside candle stubs and sealed tins, hardtack wrapped in oilcloth, a pry bar or hatchet when he could spare one, and a strip of cloth tied near the vent or draft point. So a man entering in the dark could feel for it and know the air was moving. The work was slow, and the country was hard, and the people they met along the routes looked at them with expressions that ranged from gratitude to suspicion. A cowhand at a line shack near Arrow Creek watched Petter hang a tin sign above a dugout entrance and said, "Who appointed you the shelter commission?" Peter said, "The winner." The cowhand did not laugh. He had spent January in that line shack with 2 other men and a stove that cracked on the second day. He had burned the bunk frames and the table and the door. He did not need convincing. He needed the dugout behind his shack to have a cleared vent and a supply of candles. Teaching was harder than surviving. Tilden discovered this in late April, when Petter arranged for him to demonstrate the vault principles to a group of hands at a ranch settlement near the Judith Gap. 12 men sat on fence rails in the mud and listened while Tilden explained draft reading. He held up a candle. He said, "Light it. Hold it near a vent, a crack, a gap in the wall. If the flame leans, the air's moving. If the air's moving, the room can sustain you." A man in the back said, "What if I do not have a candle?" Tilden said, "Wet your finger. Hold it near the opening. If one side of your finger is colder than the other, air is moving across it." Another man said, "What if I cannot find the vent?" Tilden said, "Then you do not enter the room." The simplicity of it frustrated some of them. They wanted complexity. They wanted a system with steps and tools, and the feeling that survival required specialized knowledge. What Tilden was telling them was simpler and more frightening. Survival required attention, the willingness to check, the discipline to check again, the humility to leave a room that felt safe but was not breathing. Peter sat on a crate behind the group and watched. He said nothing during the demonstration. Afterward, when the men had dispersed and Tilden was packing the candle stubs back into his saddlebag, Peter said, "You told them what to do. You did not make them do it." Tilden said, "I cannot force 12 men to hold candles near cracks." Peter said, "No, but you can make them hold the candle once. A man who has felt the flame lean will remember. A man who has only heard about it will forget." The next demonstration, Tilden brought 12 candles. He lit them. He handed one to each man. He took them to the dugout behind the ranch and made them kneel at the vent one at a time and watch the flame lean. Jocelyn, the young cowhand from the relief party, held his candle at the vent for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "That is the air coming out?" Tilden said, "That is the room breathing." Jocelyn said, "I never thought of a room as something that breathes." Tilden said, "Neither did I, until someone showed me." Peter's cough began in early May. It started as a clearing of the throat that happened too often, then became a sound in his chest that rattled when he breathed deeply, then became something he could not hide. The sorrel mare learned to stop when Peter bent forward in the saddle and coughed into his fist, because the coughing lasted long enough that the horse had time to lower its head and graze. Tilden said, "You should rest." Peter said, "I will rest when the last sign is hung." They had 3 more shelters to mark. Peter insisted on riding to each one. At the second, a stone spring house near a creek crossing on the road to Lewistown. The roof was damaged. A section of sod had collapsed inward, opening the ceiling to the weather. Pater climbed onto the roof to assess the repair. He was up there for 20 minutes in cold rain, measuring the gap with his hands and pulling away rotted timber. When he came down, his face was gray, and his breathing sounded like something tearing inside his chest. Tilden said, "We stop." Pater said, "One more." They hung the last sign the following morning at a powder magazine half buried in a hillside above a freight road. Pater hammered the stake into the ground himself, using his mason's hammer, the short-handled tool with the flat head and the chisel point, the handle grooves packed with mortar dust that would never come out. He struck the stake 3 times. On the 3rd strike, the hammer slipped from his hand and landed in the mud. He looked at the hammer. He looked at Tilden. He said, "My hands are done." Tilden picked up the hammer and finished driving the stake. Pater died on a Tuesday in late May in a room above a feed store in the settlement at Judith Gap. Tilden was with him. The room was small, clean, and warm. A window faced east, and the morning light came through it with the pale gold quality that means the season has turned and the killing cold is truly finished. Pater's breathing had grown shallow over 3 days. The ranch doctor, a cattle veterinarian who treated humans because no one else would GD, said the lungs were filling. He said it the way veterinarians say things about animals that cannot be saved, clearly, without hope, without drama. Tilden sat beside the bed. Brindle lay on the floor near the stove. The room smelled like wood smoke and the chemical sharpness of the tincture the doctor had left, which Pater refused to take because he said it tasted like something a mason would use to strip paint. Pater's last coherent words were not about the shelters or the vault or the winter. He said, "My father built the foundation of a church in Bergen when he was 23. The church burned twice. The walls were rebuilt twice. The foundation never moved." He closed his eyes. His breathing changed, became irregular, then shallow, then a sound like a door closing very slowly. Tilden sat with him until the sound stopped. Then he sat with him for another hour, because the room was quiet and the light was gold, and there was nowhere to go that required rushing. Pater left 3 things: the mason's hammer, which Tilden took, the candle snuffer, a brass tool bent from years of use, which Tilden took, and a notebook bound in oilskin filled with pencil sketches of cellars, spring houses, powder magazines, and root cellars across the territory. Each sketch included measurements, vent locations, floor composition, and a note about the quality of the draft. 37 sketches in all. 37 rooms that might save lives if someone could find them and mark them. Tilden took the notebook and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small, precise, and tilted to the right in the way Norwegian script leans when the hand that writes it was trained on a different alphabet. The first entry read, "Spring House, Judith Basin, south of Depot. Stone walls, earth roof, 1 vent pipe, 2-inch iron. Draft good. Floor wet in spring, dry by July. Raise bedding. A man could live here for a week." Tilden closed the notebook and put it in his coat beside Annie's letter. Mortar dust was still packed in the hammer's handle grooves. Tilden did not clean it out. He would never clean it out. The secondary crisis came in November, before the new winter had fully settled, while the memory of the last one was still sharp enough to make men flinch when the wind shifted north. A school wagon carrying a teacher named Celia Waddell and 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, ages 7, 9, and 11, left a ranch settlement east of Judith Gap at mid-morning under a sky that was cold but clear. The distance was 9 miles to the next settlement where the children lived. The driver was a boy of 16 named Amos Pruitt, hired for the season because he owned a team of draft horses steady enough to pull a covered wagon on frozen roads. By noon, the sky had changed. Not gradually, the way weather sometimes announces itself with darkening clouds and dropping pressure, but all at once, a wall of gray from the northwest that swallowed the horizon in minutes. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in an hour. The wind arrived from the north, loaded with dry snow that filled the air so thick the draft horses stopped because they could not see the road. Amos Pruitt did what every driver on the northern plains was taught to do. He tried to keep moving. The horses refused. He tried to turn back. The road was invisible. He tried to shelter in the wagon. The canvas top tore in the wind like paper. Within 30 minutes, the wagon was a skeleton of ribs and bench seats with 4 children and 1 teacher exposed to a storm that would kill a strong man in an hour. Tilden was riding Flint along the Judith Road when the storm hit. He was 2 miles south of the wagon, returning from marking a new shelter. A dugout Peter had sketched in his notebook but never visited. He had Brindle with him, and Peter's hammer hung from his saddlebag, and the notebook was in his coat. He did not find the wagon by sight. He found it because Brindle veered off the road the same way Brindle had veered off the mining road 10 months earlier, abruptly, deliberately, toward something the dog's nose found that Tilden's eyes could not. The children were huddled under the broken wagon bed. Celia Weddle was crouched over them with her coat spread wide to cover the youngest girl. Amos Pruitt was standing in the wind, holding the horses' bridles, crying silently because his hands had stopped working, and the harness buckles were beyond his fingers. Tilden did not take them to Gray Quartz. Gray Quartz was miles behind them. He took them to the nearest marked shelter, the stone milk house he had flagged 6 months earlier, half a mile off the road, half buried in a creek bank. Peter's notebook described it. Stone walls, 2 feet thick, earth roof, sawed over timber, 1 vent, natural crack in the northwest corner, draft adequate, floor dry, raised bedding. A man could live here for 3 days. Tilden had never sheltered in this room. He had marked it, cached candles and hardtack inside, cleared the vent, and moved on. He was operating now on knowledge, not luck, not Brindle's instinct, not the accident of a dead town and a forgotten vault. Pure application of principles another man had taught him, and he had learned well enough to trust in the dark. He got the children inside first, then Celia, then Amos. The milk house was small, 8 feet by 6, stone walls sweating with cold moisture, an earth floor packed hard as brick. He lit a cached candle. The vent crack drew air. The flame leaned. The room breathed. He stripped the children's wet outer clothes and wrapped them in dry grain sacks he had cached in the shelter during his marking rounds. He raised the bedding, cached planks, laid across stone blocks, and put the 3 children on it, pressed together for warmth. The youngest girl was shaking so hard her teeth made a continuous clicking sound. Tilden opened the hardtack tin and broke pieces into the girl's hand. She ate mechanically, without tasting. Celia Weddle watched everything he did. She did not panic. She did not cry. She held the candle while he worked, moving it where he needed light without being asked. When he checked the vent, she said, "What are you looking for?" Tilden said, "Air. If the flame leans, we can breathe. If it stops leaning, we leave." She said, "Leave and go where?" He said, "That is why the flame matters, so we do not have to answer that question." The storm lasted 8 hours. The milk house held. The temperature inside never dropped below freezing, because the earth walls and the stone floor and the sod roof created the same insulating envelope that Peter had described, and the gray quartz vault had proven. The children slept. Amos slept. Celia did not sleep. She sat with her back against the wall and watched the candle flame lean toward the vent crack and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Who taught you this?" Tilden said, "A mason named Peter Vangen." She said, "Where is he now?" Tilden said, "Dead." She looked at the candle. She said, "Then you are carrying what he knew." Tilden said, "I am trying." If this story reminds you why preparation matters, why the work done before the storm is the work that saves lives during it, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what Tilden built was not a shelter. It was a habit of paying attention, and that habit was about to become something bigger than one man and one dog. When the storm broke and Tilden led the wagon party back to the road, Amos Pruitt told every man at the settlement what had happened. The story spread the way stories spread in thin country, fast, with additions. Within a week, 3 different versions circulated. In one, Tilden had built the milk house himself. In another, the dog had dug through a wall of snow to reach the children. In a third, the candles in the shelter had been lit by a ghost. Tilden corrected none of them except the ghost. He said, "I cached those candles in October. A man with a plan does not need a ghost." Celia Weddle came to him 2 days after the rescue. She was not what he expected. He had expected gratitude performed, the kind of thanks that involves public statements and repeated handshakes and the discomfort of being praised for doing what any man should do. What he got was a woman standing in the doorway of the feed store at Judith Gap, holding a notebook and a pencil, asking him to explain the vent system again because she had not understood the physics, and she did not like not understanding things. She was 31. She had come from Illinois to teach because the territory paid more than the county schools back east, and because she was not interested in the life that Illinois had mapped out for women who taught school. She had a directness that made some men uncomfortable, and a handwriting so clean it looked typeset. She read faster than anyone Tilden had met, and she listened the way Pater had listened, completely, with her whole attention, asking questions only when the answer mattered. Tilden showed her the vent physics. He lit a candle and held it near the crack in the milk house wall, and she crouched beside him and watched the flame lean. She said, "The warm air rises and exits through the high point. The cold air enters through the low point. It is a chimney in reverse." Tilden said, "Pater would have liked you." She looked at him and he looked away, because the statement had come out with more weight than he intended, and the weight had to do with the fact that Pater was dead, and this woman understood in 30 seconds what some men could not grasp in 30 minutes. But Celia Weddle did not become a reward for Tilden's survival. She became a problem, the kind of problem that makes a man better. She looked at his tin signs and said, "These are readable by men who already know what they mean. A stranger would not understand check air before sleep without context." She took Pater's notebook and Tilden's rough rules and began drafting notices. Full sentences, clear instructions, written for people who had never held a candle near a vent in their lives. She wrote them in a hand that a child could read from 6 feet away, and she insisted on posting them not only at shelter entrances, but at general stores, stage stops, and church doors where people gathered and talked. Tilden said, "I'm not sure people will read a posted notice about air." Celia said, "They will read it after the first man dies because he did not." She was right, and she was formidable. And Tilden, who had survived a vault and a winter and the death of the man who taught him everything, found himself facing a challenge that Pater had never prepared him for. A woman who was his equal in stubbornness and his superior in the one skill he lacked most, making knowledge travel beyond the reach of his own 2 hands. Voss, meanwhile, had not disappeared. Voss had gone to Helena, where court sat and paper carried the force of law. He had filed claims against the Gray Quartz Bank estate. He had written letters to the territorial assessor. He was building a case not to recover provisions that had already been eaten, but to establish a precedent that abandoned property in failed mining towns belonged to creditors, and that anyone who used such property without authorization owed the estate its value. The court summons arrived at the feed store in Judith Gap on a morning in early December, carried by a rider who had no opinion about its contents and wanted only to deliver it and get out of the cold. Tilden was posting a shelter notice on the store's front wall when the rider handed him the paper. He opened it. The legal language was dense, but the demand was simple. Appear in Helena to answer charges of unauthorized appropriation of bank property, filed by Orrin Voss, receiver of claims against the Gray Quartz Mining Company estate. Celia read the summons over his shoulder. She said, "He is not trying to get the food back. The food is gone. He is trying to make you afraid of the shelters." Tilden looked at her. She said, "If he establishes that using abandoned property is theft, then every shelter you have marked on someone else's land becomes a liability. Every cached tin becomes stolen goods. Every sign becomes evidence." The wind picked at the notice Tilden had just nailed to the wall. The notice read, "In emergency, shelter is available at the marked locations on the Judith Musselshell Route. Check air before entry. Instructions inside." Tilden looked at the notice, then at the summons, then at the road that led to Helena, where Annie was waiting and Voss was waiting, and the law sat in a room that did not need to breathe because it had never been underground. He folded the summons and put it in his coat beside Pater's notebook and Annie's letter. His coat was getting heavy with paper. Paper was the one thing the vault had not prepared him for. The courtroom in Helena was a second-floor room above a hardware store, heated by a cast-iron stove that someone had stoked too hot. The windows were fogged with condensation. The judge, a man named Harkin, sat behind a table covered in green cloth and looked at the papers in front of him with the expression of a man who has read too many claims filed by men like Orrin Voss and does not expect this one to be different. Tilden arrived with Celia, who carried a leather satchel containing Pater's notebook, the ration marks plank, which Tilden had pried from the vault floor and brought as evidence, and the drafted notices she had written for the shelter program. He arrived with Brindle, who was not permitted inside the courtroom, and sat on the boardwalk outside with his torn ear cocked toward the door, waiting. He arrived for the first time in 11 months in the same town as Annie. He had found her the night before. The laundry where she worked was a narrow building on Last Chance Gulch, hot and damp inside, the air thick with lye, and the sound of women wringing water from heavy cloth. Annie was thinner than her letter had prepared him for. Her hands were red and cracked from the work. She was behind on board, not $11 now, but $6, because a woman at the laundry had lent her the difference, and Annie had been paying it back at 50 cents a week from wages that barely covered food. Tilden gave her the $2.60 in coin he still carried. He gave her $14 in cash he had earned marking shelters for ranch owners who paid in money rather than meals. He told her he would send more when he had it. Annie looked at his hands, the split palms healed into white scars, the cracked fingernails that had never fully grown back, and said, "What happened to you?" Tilden said, "I found a room." She did not understand. He did not explain. There would be time for explaining after the court. Voss presented his case with the precision of a man who had spent decades turning other people's misfortune into legal tender. He produced papers showing the Gray Quartz Mining Company had been incorporated under territorial law. He produced a chain of receivership documents establishing his authority over the company's remaining assets. He produced an inventory speculative, since he had never counted the tins himself, estimating the value of the provisions at $68, based on wholesale prices for canned goods in the 1884 market. He argued that Tilden Rusk had entered a sealed bank vault without authorization, consumed provisions belonging to the company estate, distributed those provisions to third parties without the receiver's consent, and subsequently used the vault and its contents as the basis for a shelter program that appropriated abandoned properties across the territory. He spoke calmly. He did not raise his voice. He presented the argument as a matter of property law, not morality, because property law does not require the court to consider whether a man was freezing when he opened the door. Judge Harkin listened. He looked at Tilden. He said, "Do you dispute that you entered the vault and consumed the provisions?" Tilden said, "No." Harkin said, "Do you dispute that the provisions were the property of the Gray Quartz Mining Company?" Tilden said, "I do not know who they belong to. The ledger inside the vault said they were stored by townspeople during the evacuation. The townspeople never came back. The company never came back. The provisions sat in a sealed room for 3 years. I found them because my dog dug through the rubble during a blizzard that would have killed me if I had stayed above ground." Harkin said, "And the others? Klein, Pike, and Voss himself?" Tilden said, "They came to the vault after I opened it. I fed them because they were dying, including Mr. Voss." Voss's face did not change. He had anticipated this. He said, "The question before the court is not whether Mr. Rusk's use of the provisions was understandable. The question is whether he had legal authority to enter, consume, and distribute property held in receivership. Sympathy does not override statute." Harkin looked at the papers. He looked at Voss. He said, "Who else is here to speak?" Merritt Klein spoke first. He stood at the front of the room with his right hand visible, 2 fingertips missing, the stumps healed smooth and shiny. He told the court that he had tried the main road during the storm and nearly died. He told them he reached Gray Quartz with waxy fingers and no horse and no pride. He told them Tilden had stripped his frozen coat, warmed stones by a candle, fed him condensed milk 1 sip at a time, and refused to let him eat the bulge tins even when Merritt begged. He said, "I mocked him for trusting a dog. I told him a dog would chase a rabbit into hell. The dog led him to food that saved my life." He held up his right hand. The missing fingertips were visible to everyone in the room. He said, "I lost these because I was too proud to follow a man I thought was a fool. Tilden Rusk is not a fool. He is the reason I have 8 fingers instead of none." Asa Trask spoke second. He stood with his hat in his hands and his coat buttoned to the throat, and his face set in the expression of a man performing a duty he does not enjoy but will not shirk. He told the court he had warned Tilden not to ride. He told them he expected to find a body. He told them he descended into the vault and saw the vent pipe, the plank bed, the ration marks, and the condemned tins sorted in a corner. He said, "I have worked stock on these planes for 30 years. I have seen men freeze standing up. I have seen line shacks collapse with men inside. I have never seen a man turn a bank cellar into a shelter that kept 4 people alive for 12 days in the worst winter this territory has recorded." He paused. "I told Tilden Rusk that a dog does not find mercy under ashes. I was wrong. The dog found exactly that." Celia spoke third. She did not address the legal question. She addressed the practical one. She told the court about the shelter program, 20 marked locations along the Judith Mussel Shell route, each with cached supplies, cleared ventilation, and posted instructions. She told them about the school wagon. She told them about the 3 children who slept through a storm in a stone milk house because a man they had never met had cleared a vent and cached candles 6 months before the storm arrived. She said, "The provisions in that vault were forgotten for 3 years. No one came for them. No one inventoried them. No one posted a guard or filed a claim until Mr. Voss learned that someone had used them to survive. The question is not who owned the tins. The question is whether this territory wants its law to punish the man who found them or the man who forgot them." Ranch families testified. A woman named Colquitt, whose husband had sheltered in one of the marked dugouts during a December squall, spoke for 2 minutes and cried for one of them. Jocelyn, the young cowhand, testified that Tilden had taught him to read drafts and check tins, and that he had used those skills to assess a line shack that turned out to have a block chimney that would have filled with smoke if he had lit a fire. Calder Pike spoke last. He stood slowly because his arm still bothered him, 3/4 healed but stiff in the cold. He was not an eloquent man. He had ridden with Voss for pay and had nearly died for the association. He looked at the judge, and he looked at Voss, and he said what he had said in the ruins of Grey Quartz, but now he said it under oath, in a room with a stove and fogged windows, and a green cloth on the table. He said, Mr. Voss arrived at that vault with a map, a gun, and 2 men. He claimed the food was his by law. He refused to disarm. He fired a shot into the stairwell that loosened brick and nearly collapsed the entrance. When Tilden told him the rules, no weapons, one at a time, no fire inside, Voss refused. He paused. He looked at his hands. The broken arm had healed crooked. He said, I dropped my gun and crawled in because I was going to die outside. Voss told me to come back. I did not come back. 2 days later, Voss's other man disappeared into the storm. One day after that, Voss came down the stairs himself, shaking, and handed his gun over because the cold had made him the same as the rest of us. He looked at Voss. He said, Mr. Voss valued that property until the weather made him property's beggar. He ate the same tins. He slept on the same planks. He breathed through the same vent. And now he sits in a warm room and tells this court that the man who opened the door should pay for what was inside. Calder sat down. The room was quiet except for the stove ticking as the metal expanded. Judge Harkin did not romanticize Tilden. He did not call him a hero or a pioneer or a model citizen. He ruled on the law. He said that the provisions in the Grey Quartz bank vault constituted abandoned property under territorial statute. As the company had ceased operations, the town had been evacuated, and no retrieval had been attempted in 3 years. He said that Voss's receivership papers covered financial instruments and mining claims, not emergency food stores cashed by townspeople during a fire. He said that even if the provisions could be classified as company assets, the doctrine of necessity applied. A man in a blizzard who enters an unlocked building to survive is not a trespasser. A man who consumes food to avoid starvation is not a thief. The doctrine did not excuse all appropriation, but it excused appropriation undertaken in extremis without alternative. He ordered that remaining usable provisions in the vault be inventoried and assigned to a territorial relief cache available for emergency use. He ordered that Voss pay court costs for filing a claim the court found to be in bad faith, motivated not by legitimate property recovery, but by an attempt to establish legal authority over abandoned structures that Tilden's shelter program had made useful. Voss sat through the ruling with his thin smile fixed in place. When it was done, he stood, collected his papers, and walked out of the courtroom without speaking to anyone. On the boardwalk, he passed Brindle. The dog did not growl. The dog did not even look up. Voss had been reduced to something beneath the dog's attention. Tilden watched him go. He felt no satisfaction. Voss was not destroyed. Men like Voss are not destroyed by single rulings. He would file other claims, buy other distressed property, profit from other men's failure. But the vault was free. The shelters were free. The knowledge was free. Voss could not put a lock on what Tilden and Pater had given away. The Grey Quartz rules spread the way practical knowledge spreads in thin country, not through institutions or publications, but through repetition. A cowhand learned to check air because the man at the next bunk told him to. A ranch wife cached tins in a root cellar because a posted notice at the store told her how. A stage driver carried candle stubs in his kit because Jocelyn had explained what a leaning flame meant, and the explanation had taken root in the particular soil of a man who drove through storms for a living. By the spring of 1888, Tilden and Celia had marked 26 shelters along the routes between the Muscle Shell and Helena. By winter of that year, the count was 31. Not all were maintained. Not all were stocked. The system depended on the willingness of people who used a shelter to replace what they took, and not everyone did. But enough did. Enough men cached tins after using them. Enough cleared vents. Enough left marks on the walls recording dates and conditions, so the next man would know the shelter had held. Tilden taught by demonstration, always. He never lectured. He lit candles and held them near cracks and made men watch the flame lean. He tapped walls and made them listen for hollow space. He opened tins and made them press the tops and learn the difference between sound metal and compromised metal. Pater's method. The method of the hands, of contact, of making the student feel the knowledge before hearing it explained, became Tilden's method, and it worked because the body remembers what the mind forgets. Celia turned the rough system into something that could survive without Tilden's presence. She drafted notices that were clear enough for a child to follow. She persuaded store owners and postmasters to display them. She wrote letters to ranch operations describing the shelter program and asking permission to mark structures on their land. Most said yes. The few who said no she visited in person, and after a conversation that combined the facts of the killing, Winter with the quiet force of a woman who would not be dismissed, all but one relented. The one who did not was a rancher named Haldane, who said he would not have strangers sheltering in his property because strangers stole. Celia said, "Strangers die, Mr. Haldane. Thieves can be punished. Dead men cannot be restored." Haldane looked at her for a long time and then said, "Mark the south dugout only, not the house cellar." Celia marked the south dugout and considered it a victory. Asa Trask became, in his slow and grudging way, one of the program's most effective advocates. He did not champion Tilden publicly. That was not his nature. But when young cowhands passed through the stockyards where he inspected cattle, he told them to watch their dogs. He told them to trust evidence over pride. He told them that the road is not always the safest path, and the hole in the ground is not always a grave. He said these things with the authority of a man who had been wrong once and intended never to be wrong about the same thing again. Coming from Asa Trask, who had spent 40 years building a reputation for sound judgment, the admission carried weight. Men listened to Asa not because he was enthusiastic about the shelters, but because he was reluctant. His endorsement came at visible cost, and cost made it credible. Merritt Klein became a careful man, not a cautious man. Caution implies fear, and Merritt was not afraid. He became careful, which means he checked. He checked air. He checked tins. He checked the weather before riding and the shelters before sleeping. He became a winter guide for outfits moving stock through dangerous country, and his particular skill was reading a landscape for shelter, the way a riverboat pilot reads water for depth. He told people he had learned it from Tilden Rusk, and when they asked how Tilden had learned it, Merritt said, "From a Norwegian mason and a dog that would not stop digging." Brindle became locally famous, though Tilden refused to let the fame become mythology. When a man at a gathering in Judith Gap called Brindle a miracle dog, Tilden said, "He smelled what men ignored. There is no miracle in a nose that works." The dog aged the way working dogs age, gradually at first, then all at once. By 1889, Brindle's muzzle was white, and his torn ear drooped, and his hips moved stiffly on cold mornings. He still rode beside Flint on shelter rounds, but he rode in a saddlebag now instead of running ahead. He still checked vents, pressing his nose to cracks, testing the air with the equipment God had given him, but he checked from a lying position, and when he found the draft, he settled beside it and slept. Tilden and Celia married in the autumn of 1888. There was no grand ceremony. They married at the settlement at Judith Gap, in front of the feed store where Pater had died upstairs, and Tilden had received the court summons on the front wall. A circuit preacher said the words. Asa Trask stood as witness, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt. Brindle sat at Tilden's feet throughout and yawned once during the vows. The marriage grew the way the shelter program grew, through daily work, not declaration. Celia challenged Tilden when he turned inward, when the weight of Pater's absence made him silent for days at a time. She said, "Grief is not a room you conceal yourself inside. Even grief needs a vent." The metaphor was pointed. He recognized it. He opened up not because he wanted to, but because she was right and he had learned the hard way what happens in sealed rooms. He challenged her when her precision tipped into rigidity, when she insisted on perfect wording for notices that would be nailed to fence posts and rained on within a week. He said, "The words do not have to be perfect. They have to be there." She adjusted. They adjusted each other, the way two people do when neither is willing to be less than they are, and both are willing to be more. They settled near the road station at Judith Gap rather than taking up ranch land. Tilden did not want an empire. He wanted a location where travelers passed through and could be taught, where shelters could be maintained, where the work of keeping people alive in winter could be done without the distraction of building something for himself. Celia kept records. She tracked which shelters were used, which were restocked, which needed repair. She corresponded with ranch wives and store owners across 4 counties. She maintained a ledger, a proper ledger, not ration marks scratched on a plank, that documented every shelter, every cache, every use. The ledger became the program's memory, and memory was what kept the system alive when individual attention wandered. They had 2 children, a boy first, born in 1889, named Peter, because there was no other name Tilden would consider. A girl second, born in 1891, named Ragna after a name Peter Vangen had once mentioned. His mother's name, spoken once in the spring house while lifting a lintel stone. Tilden never became rich. The shelter work paid nothing. Ranch owners sometimes gave him supplies or labor in exchange for marking structures on their land. The Territorial Relief Fund, established partly because of the court ruling, paid a small stipend for shelter maintenance. Celia's teaching brought in steady money. Together they had enough. Enough was sufficient. Enough had always been sufficient for a man who had survived on 196 tins and a 2-inch vent pipe. Brindle died in the winter of 1890, beside the stove in the road station house, on a rug Celia had placed there because the dog's hips could no longer manage bare floor. He died in his sleep, which was the death the frontier rarely granted. Tilden buried him behind the station house, on a rise that faced north, not because north was warmer, but because north was the direction the storms came from, and Brindle had spent his life facing into them. He put Peter's mason's hammer above the front door of the station house. The mortar dust was still in the handle grooves. Visitors sometimes asked about it. Tilden said, "It belonged to the man who taught me that a room can breathe." Most visitors did not understand. That was acceptable. The hammer was not for them. It was for the door, and the door was for the people who came through it, and the people who came through it were alive because somewhere along the route, a tin sign turned in the wind above a stair or a crack in a wall, and the sign said, "Check air before sleep." Years later, how many does not matter, because the point is not the calendar, but the return. Tilden rode back to Gray Quartz with his son. The boy was 9, old enough to ride all day without complaint, old enough to understand that his father was showing him something, not just taking him somewhere. They rode the mining road, which was clearer now. Ranchers used it for summer stock movement, and the ruts were worn enough to follow even when grass grew between them. Gray quartz was lower. The ruins had settled further into the earth, the way all abandoned things settle when no one holds them up. The chimney stacks were shorter. The standing walls had fallen. The livery was a rectangle of foundation stones in the grass. Wildflowers grew in the main street where snow had once blown sideways through window holes. The bank stairwell was still there. The rubble had been partly cleared by weather and partly by the visitors who came to see the vault. Not many, but enough that a rough path had been worn down the steps. The steel-plated door was still wedged open, held at the angle Tilden had forced it to on the night he followed his dog into the dark. Tilden led his son down the stairs. The vault smelled the same, dry paper and metal, the smell of a room that had kept its contents while the world above it burned and froze and burned again. The shelves were mostly empty now. The tins had been inventoried, cataloged, and distributed to the relief cache years ago. But the plank was still there. The plank where Tilden had scratched 12 ration marks and slept with Brindle against his chest. The boy touched the plank. He ran his fingers along the marks. 12 lines. 12 days. He said, "You slept here?" Tilden said, "I survived here. Sleeping came later." The boy looked at the vent pipe. He looked at the door gap. He looked at the stone floor with its plank platform still laid across it, the dead air gap still visible beneath the wood. Then the boy pointed at the plank and said, "Someone wrote something new." Tilden looked. Below the 12 ration marks, in a hand he did not recognize, smaller, steadier, scratched with a nail or a knife point, someone had added a line. The letters were rough but legible. AR first, food second, pride last. Tilden stared at the words for a long time. He did not know who had written them. A traveler, a cowhand who had sheltered here during a later storm, someone who had learned the rules and reduced them to their essence. He put his hand on his son's shoulder. The grip was deliberate, the way Peter's grip had been, not strong, but weighted with everything behind it. He said, "Remember that." The boy said, "Which part?" Tilden said, "All of it." By the end of Tilden Rusk's working life, at least 20 shelters stood marked along the route surrounding the Judith Mussel shell country. Abandoned cellars, stone milk houses, dugouts, mine powder rooms, and one bank vault in a dead silver town. The gray quartz vault was the story everyone told, but the story was never the point. The point was the tin sign turning above the stair, the cached candle in the sealed tin, the vent cleared of ice, the plank raised off the stone. The point was the habit of checking. The point was the flame that leans. Tilden lived out his later years at the road station with Celia. He was not wealthy. He was not famous beyond the routes he had marked and the hands he had taught. His name did not enter the official histories of the killing winter of 1887, which were written by men in offices who recorded cattle losses and property damage and did not think to record a cowboy who taught other cowboys to hold candles near cracks in the dark. But the signs were there, and the people who had read them were alive. And old cowhands passing through the station sometimes stopped and asked to see the hammer above the door, and Tilden let them hold it, and they felt the mortar dust in the grooves and understood something they could not say in words. Snow moving sideways through black chimneys, a dog's paws striking frozen brick, a man on his knees in the ruins of a town that had already killed itself, too cold to believe in anything except the animal beside him that would not stop digging. Asa Trask's voice at the stable door, flat and certain as a nail driven into pine. "A dog finds cattle, boy. He does not find mercy under ashes." The vault door. heat-warped and rusted and wedged open. The ration marks on the plank. Peter Vangen's hammer, mortar dust ground permanent into the handle. A tin sign turning in the wind above the stair, the words cut rough into metal by a man who understood that knowledge must be placed where hands can find it in the dark. And below, on the plank where Tilden Rusk once scratched 12 days into the wood, a stranger's hand had written the only epitaph the story needed. Air first, food second, pride last. Under the burned town, mercy had not been waiting for a lucky man. It had been waiting for someone desperate enough to listen.